What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, someone is checking into a hotel room where the previous guest never actually left? Tonight, we're diving into 11 verified accounts of hotel stays that turned into living nightmares. And I guarantee that by the end of this video, you'll never look at that hotel keycard the same way again. These aren't urban legends or campfire stories. These are documented experiences from real people who thought they were just booking a safe place to sleep, only to discover they were sharing their room with something that defied all explanation. Picture this. You're exhausted after a long day of travel. You slide that key card, hear the familiar beep, and step into what should be your sanctuary for the night. But what happens when the bed starts moving on its own? What do you do when you find a decomposing head in your hotel closet? How do you react when a woman in a wedding dress appears floating outside your window on the 15th floor? These aren't scenes from a horror movie. These are real experiences that happen to real people. And some of them are so terrifying that the guests never spoke about them until years later. From the Stanley Hotel, where F.O. Stanley himself still roams the halls, to a small inn where surgical equipment mysteriously appears in guest rooms, to luxury resorts where phantom parties echo through empty ballrooms. We're about to explore the dark side of the hospitality industry that they definitely don't mention in the travel brochures. Each story gets progressively more disturbing, and I'm warning you now. Story number 8 involves something so unsettling that it made a seasoned traveler refuse to stay in hotels above the 3rd floor ever again. If you've ever felt watched in a hotel room, if you've ever heard unexplained sounds in the hallway, or if you've ever had that creeping sensation that you weren't alone, then you need to hear these stories. But here's what I need from you right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for Verified Fears. Because these true horror experiences are exactly why this channel exists. And trust me, you don't want to miss what we're uncovering next week about haunted hospitals. Are you ready to discover why some hotel guests check out but never really leave? Let's begin with our first terrifying tale. Let's move to our first story. And I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a hotel housekeeper. You've been doing this job for 15 years. You've seen everything from messy guests to forgotten belongings. And you pride yourself on being thorough, professional, and unshakable. Nothing surprises you anymore. Or so you thought until that Tuesday morning in October, when you discovered something in room 237 that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Maria Santos had been working at the Grand Colonial Hotel in downtown Portland for over a decade and a half. She was the kind of employee every hotel manager dreams of. Punctual, meticulous, and completely reliable. She knew every corner of that historic building, from the creaky floorboards in the 3rd floor hallway to the temperamental air conditioning unit in the penthouse suite. The Grand Colonial had been her second home since she was 23 years old, and at 38, she could navigate its maze of corridors blindfolded. Tuesday, October 15th started like any other day. Maria arrived at 6 in the morning, grabbed her cart from the supply closet, and began her rounds on the 2nd floor. Room 237 was supposed to be a routine cleaning. The guest had checked out the previous evening, and according to the front desk, it was a single occupancy stay. A businessman from Seattle who had been in town for a pharmaceutical conference. Nothing unusual about that. The Grand Colonial hosted dozens of business travelers every week. But as Maria inserted her master key into room 237, she immediately noticed something was wrong. The air felt different. Heavier somehow, with an underlying smell that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the usual mustiness of a closed hotel room or the lingering scent of cologne and coffee that most business travelers left behind. This was something else entirely, something organic and unsettling that made her stomach turn slightly as she pushed open the door. The room appeared normal at first glance. The bed was unmade, which was expected. There were a few personal items scattered on the nightstand: a phone charger, some business cards, a half-empty water bottle. The bathroom showed signs of use, with damp towels hanging on the rack and toiletries arranged on the counter. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary for a recently vacated hotel room, except for that smell, which seemed to be getting stronger the longer she stood there. Maria had developed a systematic approach to cleaning over the years. She always started with the bathroom, then moved to the sleeping area, and finished with the closet and any storage spaces. It was a routine that had served her well, and she saw no reason to change it now, despite the growing unease that was settling in her chest like a cold weight. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and headed toward the bathroom, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching her. The bathroom cleaning went without incident, though she noticed that the previous guest had used an unusual amount of towels. There were at least 8 towels piled in the corner, far more than a single person would typically need for a 2-night stay. Some of them appeared to be stained with what looked like rust-colored marks. But Maria had seen worse. Business travelers sometimes cut themselves shaving or had nosebleeds from the dry hotel air. She bagged the towels and moved on to the main room. As she stripped the bed and began replacing the linens, Maria found herself glancing repeatedly at the closet door. It was slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Guests often left closet doors open after retrieving their luggage. But there was something about the way the darkness seemed to pool just beyond the opening that made her skin crawl. The smell was definitely stronger near the closet, and she was beginning to recognize what it reminded her of: the time her neighbor's cat had died under their porch and hadn't been discovered for several days. Maria tried to focus on her work, telling herself that she was being ridiculous. In 15 years of housekeeping, she had encountered everything from drug paraphernalia to exotic pets that guests had smuggled in against hotel policy. She had cleaned up after food poisoning incidents, dealt with guests who had suffered medical emergencies, and even discovered a few items that had required calls to the police. She was not easily rattled, and she wasn't about to let her imagination get the better of her now. But as she finished making the bed and began dusting the furniture, the smell became overwhelming. It was definitely coming from the closet, and it was definitely the smell of decomposition. Maria had grown up on a farm in rural Oregon, and she knew that smell intimately. Something was dead in that closet, and it had been dead for a while. Her hands began to shake slightly as she approached the closet door, her cleaning rag clutched tightly in her fist. She reached out and pulled the door open fully, expecting to find a dead mouse or perhaps a piece of forgotten food that had spoiled. What she found instead made her drop her cleaning supplies and stumble backward, her scream echoing through the empty hotel room and down the hallway beyond. There, sitting on the closet floor like a grotesque decoration, was a human head in an advanced state of decomposition. The head belonged to a middle-aged man with thinning brown hair and what had once been a neatly trimmed beard. The flesh had taken on a grayish-green hue, and the eyes had sunken deep into the skull, creating dark hollows that seemed to stare accusingly at Maria. The smell that had been bothering her all morning hit her full force now, and she barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting violently into the toilet she had just finished cleaning. Maria's screams brought the assistant manager running, and within minutes, Room 237 was swarming with police officers, detectives, and crime scene technicians. The hotel was evacuated, and the entire second floor was cordoned off as a crime scene. The head was carefully removed and sent for forensic analysis, while investigators began the grim task of trying to identify both the victim and the person responsible for this horrific discovery. The investigation revealed details that made the discovery even more disturbing. The businessman from Seattle who had been registered in room 237 had never actually existed. The credit card used to book the room had been stolen, and the identification provided at check-in had been expertly forged. Security footage showed a figure in a hooded jacket entering and leaving the hotel, but the person's face was never clearly visible. Most unsettling of all, the forensic analysis revealed that the head had been in the closet for at least a week, meaning that multiple guests had unknowingly shared their room with human remains. The victim was eventually identified as Robert Chen, a local accountant who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. He had no connection to the hotel or to any of the guests who had stayed in room 237. The case remains unsolved to this day, and the person who placed Robert Chen's head in that hotel closet has never been caught. The Grand Colonial Hotel closed permanently 6 months later. Unable to recover from the negative publicity and the psychological trauma experienced by both staff and guests, Maria Santos never worked in a hotel again. She moved back to her family's farm in rural Oregon, where she says she feels safer knowing exactly what's behind every door she opens. She still has nightmares about that Tuesday morning in October, and she can't walk past a hotel without feeling a chill run down her spine. In interviews with local media, she always ends with the same warning: you never really know what the previous guest left behind. The most chilling aspect of this story isn't just the discovery itself, but the realization of how many people had unknowingly shared their space with something so horrific. Hotel records showed that 4 different guests had stayed in room 237 during the week that Robert Chen's remains were hidden in the closet. Each of them had complained about a strange smell, but housekeeping had attributed it to plumbing issues or problems with the ventilation system. None of them had any idea they were sleeping just feet away from evidence of a brutal crime. This story serves as a terrifying reminder that hotels, despite their promise of safety and comfort, can harbor the darkest secrets. The next time you check into a hotel room, you might find yourself wondering what the previous guest really left behind, and whether that strange smell is just old carpet or something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. Let's move to our second story, and this one will make you question everything you think you know about the laws of physics. Picture yourself as a weary traveler who's just checked into what appears to be a charming, historic inn. You're looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep in an antique room filled with period furniture and old-world charm. But what happens when that heavy, centuries-old furniture decides to rearrange itself in the middle of the night, with you still lying in the bed? Jonathan Mitchell was an antique furniture appraiser from Boston who specialized in colonial-era pieces. His work required extensive travel throughout New England, visiting estate sales, private collections, and historic properties. He had spent countless nights in period inns and historic hotels, surrounded by furniture that was often older than the United States itself. At 42, Jonathan thought he had seen every type of antique bed, chair, and dresser imaginable. He prided himself on his knowledge of craftsmanship, wood types, and historical construction techniques. What he had never encountered, however, was furniture that moved on its own. The Blackwood Inn in Salem, Massachusetts, had been operating continuously since 1692, making it one of the oldest lodging establishments in America. The three-story colonial building had weathered centuries of New England winters, hosted countless travelers, and maintained its reputation as a charming step back in time. The inn's 12 guest rooms were furnished entirely with authentic period pieces, many of which had been in the building since its original construction. Room 8, where Jonathan had booked his stay, featured a massive cast-iron bed frame that the innkeeper proudly claimed had been forged by local blacksmiths in the early 1700s. Jonathan arrived at the Blackwood Inn on a cold Thursday evening in November. He had spent the day examining a collection of colonial furniture at a nearby estate and was looking forward to a quiet evening reviewing his notes and preparing his appraisal report. The innkeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, personally showed him to room 8, pointing out the historical significance of various pieces as they climbed the narrow wooden staircase. The cast-iron bed was indeed impressive. A heavy, ornate frame with intricate scrollwork that must have weighed several hundred pounds. That bed has been in this room for over 3 centuries, Mrs. Hartwell explained as she handed Jonathan the old-fashioned skeleton key. It was crafted by the same blacksmith who made the iron fittings for the Salem courthouse. Quite a piece of history you'll be sleeping in tonight. She paused at the doorway, her expression becoming slightly more serious. The room can get a bit chilly at night, and sometimes the old building settles and creaks. Don't let it disturb your sleep. Jonathan thanked her and settled into the room, immediately drawn to examine the bed frame more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The iron had been shaped and welded with a skill that was rarely seen in modern metalwork. The bed was positioned against the far wall, beneath a window that looked out onto the inn's small garden. Heavy wooden floorboards, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, stretched across the room, and Jonathan noted that the bed's weight had created slight indentations in the wood, where it had rested for so many years. After a light dinner in the inn's dining room, Jonathan returned to his rooms around 9 o'clock. He spent an hour working on his laptop, documenting the day's findings and preparing preliminary valuations for the estate collection. The room was indeed chilly, as Mrs. Hartwell had warned, but the thick quilts on the bed provided adequate warmth. By 10:30, Jonathan was ready for sleep. He changed into his pajamas, brushed his teeth in the small adjoining bathroom, and settled into the antique bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable for something so old, and Jonathan found himself drifting off to sleep quickly despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The inn was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling timber and the distant sound of wind through the bare November trees outside his window. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, historic atmosphere that Jonathan had come to appreciate during his travels. He was awakened sometime after midnight by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. A low, grinding noise that seemed to be coming from directly beneath him. Still half asleep, Jonathan assumed it was the old building's heating system or perhaps pipes settling in the walls. But as he became more alert, he realized the sound was much closer than that. It was coming from the bed itself, and more disturbing still, he could feel a subtle vibration through the mattress. Jonathan sat up in the darkness, his heart beginning to race as he tried to make sense of what he was experiencing. The grinding sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like metal scraping against wood. And then, to his absolute horror, he felt the bed begin to move. Not a gentle settling or shifting, but a deliberate, purposeful movement across the floor. The massive cast-iron frame was sliding away from the wall, carrying Jonathan with it. At first, the movement was slow and steady, just a few inches at a time. Jonathan grabbed the sides of the mattress, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The bed was moving on its own, somehow gliding across the wooden floor despite its enormous weight. The grinding sound grew louder as the iron frame scraped against the floorboards, leaving deep gouges in the centuries-old wood. Jonathan tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. The bed continued its inexorable journey across the room, moving in a straight line toward the opposite wall. As it traveled, Jonathan could hear the wooden floorboards groaning under the shifting weight, and he could feel the entire structure of the bed frame vibrating with some unseen force. The scrollwork on the headboard seemed to cast writhing shadows in the moonlight, streaming through the window. The movement wasn't random or chaotic. It was deliberate and controlled, as if some invisible force was carefully repositioning the bed for a specific purpose. Jonathan found himself pressed against the headboard as the bed continued its journey, too terrified to jump off and too fascinated by the impossibility of what he was witnessing to look away. The cast-iron frame moved with surprising smoothness, as if it were floating just above the floor rather than scraping across it. When the bed finally came to rest against the far wall, directly opposite from where it had started, the grinding sound had stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the noise had been. Jonathan sat in the darkness, his heart pounding, trying to convince himself that he had been dreaming. But the evidence was undeniable. He was now positioned against a completely different wall, and he could see the deep scratches the bed frame had left in the wooden floor, marking its path across the room like a scar. For the next hour, Jonathan remained motionless in the bed, afraid that any movement might trigger another episode. He strained his ears for any sound that might explain what had happened, perhaps someone in the room below or above, or some mechanical system in the building that could account for the movement. But the inn remained silent, and no rational explanation presented itself. Just as Jonathan was beginning to think the ordeal was over, the grinding sound returned. This time, the bed began moving in the opposite direction, slowly making its way back toward its original position against the window wall. Jonathan gripped the mattress so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his body rigid with terror as he was carried across the room once again. The journey back seemed to take longer, with the bed pausing occasionally as if considering its path before continuing its deliberate movement. When the bed finally settled back into its original position, the indentations in the floorboards aligning perfectly with the marks it had worn over 3 centuries, Jonathan knew with absolute certainty that he had experienced something beyond natural explanation. The cast-iron frame fit back into its worn grooves as if it had never moved. But the fresh scratches across the floor told a different story. Jonathan didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat upright in the bed, watching the shadows and listening for any sign that the movement might resume. When dawn finally broke, he quickly packed his belongings and went downstairs to check out. Mrs. Hartwell was behind the front desk, and she looked at him with concern when she saw his pale, exhausted appearance. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Jonathan hesitated, unsure how to explain what he had experienced. The bed. It moved during the night, across the room and back again. Mrs. Hartwell's face grew solemn, and she nodded slowly. Room 8 has always been active. The bed has been doing that for as long as anyone can remember. We've had structural engineers examine the building, thinking it might be settling or vibration from traffic, but they found nothing that could explain it. The bed only moves when someone is sleeping in it, and it always returns to its original position by morning. She paused, studying Jonathan's shaken expression. We don't advertise that particular feature of the room. Most guests assume they were dreaming, and we don't discourage that interpretation. But you're not the first person to ask about it, and you won't be the last. Jonathan checked out immediately, despite having paid for a 2-night stay. As he loaded his car, he looked back at the window of room 8 and shuddered. The Blackwood Inn looked perfectly normal in the morning light, a charming colonial building with a rich history and period furnishings. But Jonathan knew that appearances could be deceiving, and that some antiques carried more than just historical significance. He never returned to the Blackwood Inn, and he made a point of researching the history of any hotel bed before booking a room. In his professional reports, he began including a new category of assessment: paranormal activity level. Room 8's cast iron bed would have received his highest rating in that category, a piece of furniture so haunted that it couldn't rest, even after 3 centuries of service. The experience changed Jonathan's perspective on antique furniture forever. He realized that some pieces don't just hold historical value, they hold memories, emotions, and perhaps even the spirits of those who use them. And sometimes, those spirits aren't content to remain still. Let's move to our third story. And this one takes us to the misty mountains of Shimla, India, where the thin air isn't the only thing that will leave you breathless. Imagine you're staying in a luxury hotel perched high on a mountainside, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the valley below. Now imagine looking out that window at 3 in the morning and seeing something that shouldn't exist. A woman in white floating in midair, 15 stories above the ground, staring directly at you with eyes that hold centuries of sorrow. Dr. Priya Sharma was a successful cardiac surgeon from Mumbai who had been working 18-hour days for the past 6 months. Her colleagues had been urging her to take a vacation, warning her about burnout and the toll that constant stress was taking on her health. Finally, in March of 2019, she decided to book a week-long retreat at the Oberoi Cecil in Shimla, one of India's most prestigious hill station hotels. She was looking forward to crisp mountain air, peaceful walks through colonial-era architecture, and most importantly, uninterrupted sleep in a luxurious suite, far from the chaos of Mumbai's hospitals. The Oberoi Cecil had been a landmark in Shimla since 1884, originally built during the British colonial period when the hill station served as the summer capital of British India. The hotel had been meticulously restored to maintain its Victorian grandeur while incorporating modern amenities. Dr. Sharma had specifically requested a suite on the 15th floor with panoramic mountain views, wanting to wake up each morning to the sight of the Himalayan foothills stretching endlessly into the distance. Her suite was everything she had hoped for. Elegantly appointed with period furniture, a marble bathroom with a deep, soaking tub, and most impressively, an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the Shimla Valley. The windows were fitted with a glass platform that extended slightly beyond the building's facade, creating the illusion that guests were floating above the mountainside when they stood on it. It was an architectural marvel that had been featured in numerous travel magazines and was one of the hotel's most photographed features. Dr. Sharma arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and for the first 2 days of her stay, everything was perfect. She slept deeply for the first time in months, enjoyed leisurely meals on the hotel's terrace, and spent hours reading on the glass platform while watching clouds drift through the valley below. The altitude took some adjustment. At over 7,000 feet above sea level, even simple activities left her slightly breathless. But she found the mountain environment incredibly restorative. On Thursday night, Dr. Sharma went to bed earlier than usual, around 10 o'clock, feeling more relaxed than she had in years. The suite was perfectly climate-controlled, and the thick curtains blocked out any light from the hotel's exterior illumination. She had been sleeping soundly for several hours when she was awakened by what sounded like tapping on glass. At first, she incorporated the sound into her dreams, but as she became more alert, she realized the tapping was real and rhythmic, like someone knocking on a window. Dr. Sharma sat up in bed, immediately disoriented. She was on the 15th floor of a hotel built into a mountainside. There was no balcony outside her windows, no fire escape, and certainly no way for anyone to be tapping on the glass from the outside. The tapping continued, soft but persistent, coming from the direction of the large windows that faced the valley. She checked her phone. It was 3:17 a.m. Moving cautiously toward the windows, Doctor. Sharma pulled back the heavy curtains and peered out into the darkness. The valley below was shrouded in mist, and the only illumination came from a few distant lights in the town far below. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar view of the mountainside dropping away into darkness. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, floating in the air approximately 10 feet beyond the glass platform, was the figure of a woman. She appeared to be suspended in midair with no visible means of support, her feet dangling freely above the 15-story drop to the rocky mountainside below. The woman was dressed in a white sari that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, moving gently as if stirred by a breeze that Dr. Sharma couldn't feel through the sealed windows. Dr. Sharma's medical training had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. She blinked hard, rubbed her eyes, and looked again, certain that altitude and exhaustion were causing hallucinations. But the woman was still there, and as Dr. Sharma watched in growing terror, the figure slowly turned to face the hotel window. The woman's face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed to hold infinite sadness. Most disturbing of all, she appeared to be looking directly at Dr. Sharma through the glass. The floating woman raised one hand and began tapping on an invisible barrier in the air, the same rhythmic knocking that had awakened Dr. Sharma. Each tap seemed to echo through the suite, despite the impossibility of sound traveling through the sealed windows and across the empty space between the figure and the building. The woman's mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no words reached Dr. Sharma's ears. Only that persistent, haunting tapping that seemed to come from inside her own head. Dr. Sharma stood frozen at the window for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching this impossible apparition floating in the mountain air. The woman's expression was one of desperate pleading, as if she were trying to communicate something urgent. Her white sari billowed around her, despite the absence of any visible wind, and occasionally she would drift slightly closer to the building before floating back to her original position. As a doctor, Dr. Sharma had witnessed death many times, and she had developed a clinical understanding of mortality that helped her cope with loss. But there was something about this floating figure that spoke to a deeper, more primal fear. The terror of encountering something that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death. The woman's eyes held a quality that Dr. Sharma had seen before in the final moments of patients who were slipping away, but magnified and intensified beyond anything she had experienced in a hospital setting. The tapping grew more urgent, and the floating woman began gesturing toward the glass platform, as if encouraging Dr. Sharma to step outside. The invitation was clear, but the impossibility of the situation was equally obvious. The glass platform was designed for viewing, not for meeting supernatural visitors suspended in midair. Dr. Sharma remained pressed against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to make sense of what she was witnessing. Suddenly, the woman's expression changed from pleading to something approaching anger or frustration. She raised both hands and began striking the invisible barrier more forcefully, the tapping becoming a frantic pounding that seemed to reverberate through the entire suite. Dr. Sharma could see the woman's mouth moving more rapidly now, as if she were shouting, though still no sound penetrated the sealed windows. The white sari began to flutter more violently, and the woman's hair whipped around her face as if caught in a supernatural storm. Then, as abruptly as the encounter had begun, it ended. The floating woman stopped her frantic gesturing and looked directly into Dr. Sharma's eyes one final time. Her expression softened back to the original sadness, and she seemed to mouth a single word that Dr. Sharma couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Help." Then the figure began to fade, becoming translucent and finally disappearing entirely, leaving only the empty darkness of the mountain valley and the distant lights of Shimla twinkling far below. Dr. Sharma remained at the window for the rest of the night, afraid to return to bed and equally afraid to look away from the spot where the woman had appeared. When dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink, the beauty of the sunrise seemed almost obscene after the horror of the night's encounter. She had experienced something that challenged every rational belief she held about the nature of reality. And she knew that her life had been fundamentally changed by those few minutes of impossible contact. At breakfast, Dr. Sharma cautiously asked the hotel staff about the history of the building and whether any guests had reported unusual experiences. The concierge, an elderly Sikh gentleman who had worked at the hotel for over 30 years, listened to her carefully worded questions with growing concern. Finally, he asked her to accompany him to his office, where he pulled out a thick folder filled with incident reports and guest complaints. "You saw her too," he said simply, not making it a question. "The woman in white. She appears to guests in the mountain-facing suites, always between 3 and 4 in the morning, always floating outside the windows. We've had dozens of reports over the years, but we don't advertise the phenomenon for obvious reasons." He showed Dr. Sharma photographs taken by previous guests. Blurry images captured through hotel windows showing a white figure suspended in the darkness beyond the glass platforms. Some photos were clearer than others, but all showed the same woman in the same white sari, floating impossibly in the mountain air. The concierge explained that hotel management had researched the history extensively, trying to understand the origin of the apparition. Her identity was Kamala Devi. He proceeded, retrieving a faded newspaper article from 1923. She was married to a British colonial administrator who served in Shimla. Based on documented evidence, she learned of her husband's romantic involvement with a local woman, and consumed by anguish, she leapt from the precipice where this hotel currently stands. Her remains were never located. The mountainside remains too steep and treacherous. Yet visitors have witnessed her presence ever since this hotel was constructed on this location. Dr. Sharma studied the newspaper clipping, which included a small photograph of Kamala Devi. The resemblance to the floating woman was unmistakable. The same delicate features, the same sad eyes, the same long black hair. The article described her as a devoted wife who had been devastated by her husband's betrayal and who had chosen death over the shame of a broken marriage. She seems to be drawn to women who are alone, the concierge explained. Particularly professional women who are dealing with stress or personal struggles. We think she recognizes something of her own pain in them, and she's trying to communicate, perhaps to warn them or to ask for help in finding peace. Dr. Sharma checked out of the hotel that morning, despite having paid for a full week's stay. As her taxi wound down the mountain roads toward the railway station, she looked back at the Oberoi Cecil one final time. The building looked elegant and peaceful in the morning sunlight, its windows reflecting the blue sky and white clouds. But she knew that when darkness fell, Kamala Devi would return to her eternal vigil, floating in the mountain air and tapping on windows, trying to bridge the gap between the world of the living and whatever realm she now inhabited. The experience changed Dr. Sharma's perspective on life and death in ways that her medical training never could. She returned to Mumbai with a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that exist beyond scientific understanding, and she never again dismissed patients' accounts of supernatural experiences during near-death episodes. Sometimes, she realized, the most important truths can't be measured or explained. They can only be witnessed and remembered. And sometimes, late at night when she's working in the hospital, Dr. Sharma finds herself looking out the windows of the upper floors, half expecting to see a woman in the white floating in the darkness, still searching for someone who might understand her eternal sorrow. Let's move to our fourth story. And this one will make you question whether some places are meant to remain frozen in time for a very good reason. Imagine checking into a charming historic inn, expecting quaint colonial charm and perhaps a ghost story or two to entertain fellow travelers. But what happens when you discover that your cozy guest room was once an operating theater, and the spirits of long-dead patients are still waiting for surgery that will never come? Dr. Marcus Webb was a retired orthopedic surgeon from Philadelphia who had developed a passion for medical history after ending his 40-year career. At 68, he spent his time visiting historic medical sites, collecting antique surgical instruments, and writing articles for medical journals about the evolution of surgical techniques. His particular interest was in colonial-era medicine, and he had planned a week-long research trip through New England to visit locations where early American medical practices had been documented. The Colonial Inn in Concord, Massachusetts, had been on Dr. Webb's research list for months. Built in 1716, the inn had served multiple purposes throughout its long history. Originally a private residence, then a general store, and during the Revolutionary War, it had been converted into a makeshift hospital for wounded soldiers. The building's medical history was exactly what drew Dr. Webb to book a stay there in late September, hoping to gather material for an article about battlefield medicine during the colonial period. When Dr. Webb arrived at the Colonial Inn on a crisp Thursday afternoon, he was immediately impressed by the building's authentic preservation. The low-beamed ceilings, wide plank floors, and hand-forged hardware had been maintained exactly as they would have appeared 3 centuries ago. The innkeeper, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, was a local historian who took pride in sharing the building's rich past with guests who showed genuine interest in its heritage. "You'll be staying in room 424, Mrs. Morrison explained as she led Dr. Webb up the narrow wooden staircase. "It's one of our most historically significant rooms. During the Revolutionary War, this was where the most serious surgical procedures were performed. The room still contains some original fixtures from that period, including the wooden table where colonial surgeons worked to save the lives of wounded patriots." Room 424 was larger than Dr. Webb had expected, with a slanted ceiling that followed the roofline and 2 small windows that looked out onto the inn's herb garden. The centerpiece of the room was indeed a massive wooden table, positioned directly in the center of the space. The table was clearly very old, made from thick oak planks that had been worn smooth by centuries of use. Dark stains were visible in the wood grain, and Dr. Webb recognized them immediately as the kind of permanent discoloration that only comes from repeated exposure to blood. This table is original to the Revolutionary War period, Mrs. Morrison continued, running her hand along the scarred surface. Local records indicate that over 200 surgical procedures were performed on this table between 1775 and 1783. Amputations, bullet extractions, treatment of infected wounds, all the desperate measures that colonial surgeons used to try to save lives with the limited medical knowledge of the time. Dr. Webb was fascinated by the historical significance of the room, but he couldn't help noticing how the atmosphere felt different from the rest of the inn. The air seemed heavier somehow, and there was an underlying smell that reminded him of the antiseptic solutions used in modern operating rooms, though he knew that such chemicals hadn't existed during the colonial period. The room was also noticeably colder than the hallway, despite the warm September weather outside. After settling into the room and examining the antique surgical table more closely, Dr. Webb spent the evening in the inn's common room, discussing the building's medical history with Mrs. Morrison and other guests. She showed him historical documents and photographs that detailed the room's use as an operating theater, including a disturbing account written by a Continental Army surgeon who had worked in that very space. The surgeon's journal described the primitive conditions, the lack of anesthesia, and the heartbreaking number of soldiers who had died on that wooden table, despite the medical staff's best efforts. Dr. Webb retired to room 424 around 11 o'clock, looking forward to spending the night in such a historically significant space. He had brought several medical history books with him, and he planned to do some reading before sleep, surrounded by the authentic atmosphere of colonial medicine. The room was illuminated by reproduction oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating an ambiance that transported him back to the 18th century. As he prepared for bed, Dr. Webb found himself repeatedly drawn to examine the surgical table. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The table had been built to withstand the weight and movement of struggling patients, with thick legs and reinforced joints that had held firm for over 2 centuries. The surface showed not only blood stains, but also deep scratches and gouges where surgical instruments had been used, and rope burns along the edges where patients had been restrained during procedures performed without anesthesia. Dr. Webb was awakened sometime after midnight by sounds coming from directly below his room. At first, he assumed it was other guests moving around in the inn, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the sounds were much more specific and disturbing. He could hear what sounded like muffled voices engaged in urgent conversation, the scraping of metal instruments against wood, and most unsettling of all, the kind of desperate moaning that he recognized from his own surgical career as the sound of patients in extreme pain. Sitting up in bed, Dr. Webb tried to rationalize what he was hearing. The Colonial Inn was a popular destination, and it was possible that other guests were watching television or having late-night conversations. But the sounds were too consistent and too specific to be explained by normal hotel activity. The voices had the clipped, professional tone of medical personnel working under pressure, and the instrumental sounds were unmistakably those of surgical procedures being performed. As Dr. Webb listened, the sounds seemed to be getting closer, as if they were moving up through the building toward his room. The muffled conversations became clearer, and he began to make out individual words and phrases. Hold him down. The bleeding won't stop. We're losing him. And most chilling of all, bring him to the table. The voices had the accent and the speech patterns of colonial-era English, formal and precise in a way that modern Americans rarely spoke. Then, to Dr. Webb's absolute horror, he heard footsteps on the wooden stairs leading to the 4th floor, accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged or carried. The footsteps were deliberate and purposeful, moving directly toward room 424. Dr. Webb could hear multiple people breathing heavily, as if they were carrying a significant weight. And occasionally, he caught fragments of whispered instructions about lifting and positioning. The footsteps stopped directly outside Dr. Webb's door, and for a moment, the hallway was completely silent. Then came the sound of the door handle turning, though Dr. Webb was certain he had locked the door before going to bed. The door swung open slowly, creaking on its ancient hinges, but the hallway beyond appeared to be empty. No figures were visible in the dim light from the reproduction sconces. Yet Dr. Webb could clearly hear people entering his room. What happened next challenged every rational belief Dr. Webb held about the nature of reality. He watched in terror as invisible hands seemed to manipulate the surgical table, adjusting its position and preparing it for use. He could hear the scraping of the wooden legs against the floor as the table was moved, and he could see indentations appearing in the surface as if heavy objects were being placed on it. The sounds of medical preparation continued, the clink of metal instruments, the rustle of fabric, and the urgent whispers of medical personnel working to save a life. Then came the most disturbing part of the encounter. Dr. Webb heard the unmistakable sound of a human body being lifted onto the surgical table, followed by the desperate screams of a patient who was fully conscious and aware of what was about to happen to him. The screams were muffled, as if the patient's mouth were being covered, but the terror and pain in those sounds were absolutely real and heartbreaking. Dr. Webb, despite his medical training and decades of experience with surgical procedures, found himself paralyzed by the horror of what he was witnessing. He could hear the colonial surgeons working frantically, their voices becoming more urgent as they struggled to save their patient. The sounds of the surgery were graphically detailed: the sawing of bone, the tearing of flesh, the splash of blood hitting the wooden floor. Most disturbing of all, he could hear the patient's vital signs failing, his breathing becoming more labored and finally stopping altogether. The phantom surgery continued for what felt like hours, with Dr. Webb listening to procedure after procedure being performed on the invisible table. Each patient brought different challenges. Some were conscious and screaming. Others were already unconscious from blood loss or shock. The colonial surgeons worked with desperate determination, but Dr. Webb's modern medical knowledge allowed him to recognize that most of their efforts were futile. The patients were dying from infections, blood loss, and the trauma of primitive surgical techniques performed without proper anesthesia or antiseptic procedures. As dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded, and the room returned to its normal quiet state. The surgical table appeared to be back in its original position, though Dr. Webb was certain it had been moved during the night. The air still carried that strange antiseptic smell, now mixed with something that reminded him of the metallic scent of blood. Most disturbing of all, when he examined the table more closely in the morning light, he found what appeared to be fresh scratches in the wood's surface, as if surgical instruments had been used on it during the night. Dr. Webb barely slept for the remainder of his stay at the Colonial Inn, but he couldn't bring himself to leave early. His scientific curiosity compelled him to document everything he had experienced, and he spent the following days researching the specific history of room 424. What he discovered made the phantom surgery even more disturbing. Mrs. Morrison showed him detailed records from the Revolutionary War period, including the personal journal of Dr. Ezekiel Whitmore, the chief surgeon who had worked in that room. Dr. Whitmore's entries described the impossible conditions under which he had been forced to operate. No anesthesia beyond alcohol and laudanum, no understanding of infection control, and a constant stream of wounded soldiers who arrived faster than they could be treated. The journal revealed that Dr. Whitmore had become increasingly desperate and guilt-ridden as patient after patient died on his surgical table, despite his best efforts to save them. The final entry in Dr. Whitmore's journal was particularly haunting. "I fear that the souls of those brave men who perished under my knife will never find peace. They trusted me to heal them, and I failed them all. May God forgive me for the pain I have caused, and may these poor spirits find the rest that I cannot give them in life." Dr. Webb realized that he had witnessed the eternal repetition of Dr. Whitmore's surgical procedures, with the spirits of long-dead patients still arriving for treatment that could never save them. The phantom surgery was not just a haunting. It was a tragedy that continued to play out night after night, with colonial-era medical personnel still trying to heal wounds that had been fatal over 2 centuries ago. When Dr. Webb finally checked out of the Colonial Inn, he left with a profound new understanding of the connection between medicine and the supernatural. He had spent his career saving lives with modern surgical techniques, but he had never considered the psychological toll that primitive medicine had taken on early practitioners. The spirits in room 424 weren't malevolent. They were trapped in an endless cycle of medical desperation, still trying to fulfill their oath to do no harm in a time when harm was often unavoidable. Dr. Webb never published the article about colonial medicine that he had planned to write. Instead, he became an advocate for recognizing the psychological trauma experienced by historical medical personnel, and he established a scholarship fund for medical students studying the history of surgical ethics. He understood now that some wounds never heal, and that the ghosts of medicine's past continue to haunt the places where healing and death intersected in ways that modern practitioners can barely imagine. The Colonial Inn still operates today, and room 424 is still available for guests who are interested in experiencing authentic colonial history. But Mrs. Morrison now includes a subtle warning in her historical presentations. Some guests report unusual sounds during the night, which we attribute to the building's age and the weight of its medical history. We recommend that visitors with sensitive dispositions might prefer our rooms on the lower floors. For those brave enough to spend the night in room 424, the experience serves as a powerful reminder that the practice of medicine has always been a battle between life and death, and that some battles continue long after the war has ended. Let's move to our 5th story. And this one will show you that some love stories are so powerful, they transcend death itself, binding souls to the places where their hearts were broken. Picture the most elegant hotel ballroom you've ever seen, filled with the laughter and music of a wedding celebration. Now imagine that same ballroom decades later, where the bride still dances alone, waiting for a groom who will never return, and where guests occasionally find themselves invited to a wedding that ended in tragedy long before they were born. Rebecca Chen was a wedding photographer from Chicago who specialized in luxury hotel ceremonies. Over her 15-year career, she had captured thousands of magical moments in some of America's most prestigious venues. But she had never encountered anything quite like the assignment that brought her to the Seelbach Hilton in Louisville, Kentucky, in October 2018. The hotel had contacted her specifically to photograph a high-profile wedding in their famous ballroom, and the generous fee they offered was too attractive to refuse, even though it meant traveling during her typically slow autumn season. The Seelbach Hilton had been Louisville's crown jewel since 1905, hosting everyone from presidents to movie stars in its opulent halls. The hotel's grand ballroom was particularly renowned for its crystal chandeliers, marble columns, and intricate ceiling murals that had been restored to their original Edwardian splendor. Rebecca had seen photographs of the ballroom in wedding magazines, but experiencing it in person was breathtaking. The space seemed to glow with an inner light that made every surface appear touched by gold. Rebecca arrived 2 days before the wedding to scout locations and test lighting setups. The bride, Jennifer Morrison, was marrying into one of Kentucky's oldest bourbon families, and no expense had been spared for the celebration. The grand ballroom had been reserved for the entire weekend, with the ceremony scheduled for Saturday evening, followed by a reception that was expected to continue well into the night. Rebecca spent Friday afternoon working with the hotel's event coordinator to plan camera positions and lighting arrangements that would capture the ballroom's magnificent architecture while focusing on the intimate moments of the celebration. As Rebecca worked in the empty ballroom, adjusting her equipment and taking test shots, she became aware of an unusual atmosphere in the space. Despite the room's grandeur and the excitement of the upcoming celebration, there was an underlying sadness that seemed to permeate the air. The hotel staff members she worked with were professional and helpful, but she noticed that several of them seemed reluctant to spend extended time in the ballroom, particularly near the area where the bride and groom would exchange vows. That evening, Rebecca was reviewing her test photographs in her hotel room when she noticed something strange in several of the images. In the background of shots taken near the ballroom's main entrance, there appeared to be a figure in white standing in the shadows between the marble columns. The figure was translucent and barely visible, but it had the unmistakable silhouette of a woman in a wedding dress. Rebecca assumed it was a reflection or a trick of the lighting, but the figure appeared in multiple shots taken from different angles, always in the same location. Rebecca decided to return to the ballroom that night to investigate the lighting issue that was causing the strange reflections. She used her key card to access the space around midnight, expecting to find the room empty and dark. Instead, she discovered that the ballroom was softly illuminated by what appeared to be candlelight, though she could see no actual candles or light sources. The crystal chandeliers were dark, but the room was filled with a warm, golden glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As Rebecca stood in the doorway, trying to understand the source of the mysterious illumination, she heard the faint sound of music drifting through the air. It was a waltz, played on what sounded like a full orchestra, but the melody was distant and ethereal, as if it were coming from another time or dimension. The music was hauntingly beautiful, with a melancholy quality that made Rebecca's heart ache with an emotion she couldn't identify. Then, to her absolute amazement, she saw her, a young woman in an elaborate Victorian wedding dress, standing alone in the center of the ballroom. The bride was breathtakingly beautiful, with dark hair arranged in an intricate updo and a veil that cascaded to the floor like a waterfall of silk and lace. Her dress was a masterpiece of 1920s craftsmanship, with thousands of tiny pearls and crystals that caught the mysterious light and made her appear to shimmer like a vision from a dream. The phantom bride was dancing alone, moving gracefully to the ethereal waltz music as if she were in the arms of an invisible partner. Her movements were fluid and elegant, the kind of formal ballroom dancing that had been popular in the early decades of the 20th century. As she danced, her expression was one of pure joy and anticipation, as if she were celebrating the happiest moment of her life. But there was also something heartbreaking about her solitary dance, a loneliness that was almost palpable. Rebecca stood transfixed, watching this impossible scene unfold before her. The phantom bride seemed completely unaware of her presence, lost in her own world of eternal celebration. As the music continued, other figures began to appear in the ballroom. Ghostly wedding guests in period clothing, a phantom orchestra in the corner, and waiters carrying silver trays of champagne that sparkled like liquid starlight. The entire wedding party from another era was materializing around the dancing bride, creating a celebration that existed outside of time. The phantom wedding was everything Rebecca had ever dreamed of capturing in her photography. The perfect blend of romance, elegance, and timeless beauty. Without thinking, she raised her camera and began taking photographs, the flash illuminating the supernatural scene in stark detail. The ghostly figures didn't seem to notice the modern intrusion, continuing their eternal celebration as if Rebecca weren't there. As Rebecca photographed the phantom wedding, she began to understand that she was witnessing a tragedy as much as a celebration. The bride's joy was tinged with desperation, and her dancing became more frantic as the music continued. She kept looking toward the ballroom's main entrance, as if waiting for someone who was supposed to arrive but never would. The other ghostly figures seemed to be trying to comfort her, but their efforts were futile. The bride was trapped in a moment of anticipation that would never be fulfilled. The phantom groom never appeared. Rebecca watched for over an hour as the bride danced alone, surrounded by her ghostly wedding party, waiting for a man who would never come to claim her as his wife. The music grew more melancholy as the night progressed, and the bride's movements became slower and more sorrowful. Finally, as dawn approached, the entire scene began to fade, with the ghostly figures becoming translucent and finally disappearing entirely, leaving Rebecca alone in the dark, empty ballroom. The next morning, Rebecca approached the hotel's concierge about the history of the grand ballroom, carefully avoiding any mention of what she had witnessed. The concierge, an elderly gentleman who had worked at the Seelbach for over 30 years, listened to her questions with growing interest before inviting her to his office to see the hotel's historical archives. "You're asking about Patricia Wilson," he said, pulling out a leather-bound scrapbook filled with yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs. "She was supposed to be married in our grand ballroom on October 15th, 1925. It was going to be the social event of the season. Her father was one of Louisville's most prominent businessmen, and her fiancé was from a wealthy New York family. Everything was perfect except for one problem. The groom never showed up." The concierge showed Rebecca a newspaper photograph of Patricia Wilson in her wedding dress, and Rebecca's blood ran cold. It was unmistakably the same woman she had seen dancing in the ballroom the night before. The photograph captured Patricia's beauty and elegance, but it also revealed the same underlying sadness that Rebecca had witnessed in the phantom bride's expression. According to press accounts, Patricia stayed in the bridal chamber for over 3 hours, declining to believe that her intended would fail to appear. The concierge continued. The ceremony guests gathered in the ballroom, the ensemble performed, and the sparkling wine was offered, but there was no husband-to-be and no ritual. Patricia ultimately emerged to the ballroom in her bridal attire and moved alone while the musicians played her cherished dance. She perished 3 days later, Some attribute it to a shattered spirit. Others murmur it was intentional. The concierge explained that Patricia's spirit had been seen in the grand ballroom countless times over the decades. Always in her wedding dress, always dancing alone, always waiting for her faithless groom to arrive. Hotel's staff had learned to work around her presence, and many guests had reported seeing a beautiful woman in white during their own wedding celebrations. Most assumed she was part of the hotel's ambiance, never realizing they were witnessing a tragedy that had been playing out for nearly a century. She seems drawn to other weddings, the concierge noted, as if she's hoping that by witnessing other couples' happiness, she might finally find the peace that was denied to her. Some brides report feeling a presence during their ceremonies, a sense that someone is watching over them and wishing them well. We like to think that Patricia has become the hotel's guardian angel for lovers, ensuring that other couples don't suffer the heartbreak she experienced. Rebecca photographed the Morrison wedding that Saturday evening, but she found herself constantly watching for signs of Patricia's presence. During the ceremony, she noticed a subtle change in the light near the altar, and several of her photographs showed unexplained orbs of light surrounding the bride and groom. The reception was beautiful and joyful, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed by someone who longed to experience such happiness herself. When Rebecca developed her photographs from Friday night's encounter, she discovered that her camera had captured the phantom wedding in extraordinary detail. The images showed Patricia Wilson and her ghostly wedding party with perfect clarity, frozen in moments of eternal celebration and eternal sorrow. The photographs were both beautiful and heartbreaking, documenting a love story that had been interrupted by betrayal and transformed into a haunting that had lasted for nearly a century. Rebecca never published the photographs of Patricia's phantom wedding, feeling that such intimate moments of supernatural grief deserved privacy and respect. Instead, she created a private album that she kept as a reminder of the power of love to transcend death and the tragedy of promises broken. She returned to the Seelbach Hilton several times over the following years, always hoping to encounter Patricia again. But the phantom bride appeared only when she chose to, dancing her eternal dance in a ballroom filled with memories of what might have been. The experience changed Rebecca's approach to wedding photography forever. She began to see each ceremony not just as a celebration, but as a sacred moment that deserved to be preserved with reverence and care. She understood now that love stories don't always have happy endings, but that the power of true love can create its own form of immortality, binding souls to the places where their hearts were given and broken. The Seelbach Hilton's Grand Ballroom continues to host weddings and celebrations, and Patricia Wilson continues her eternal wait, dancing alone to music that only she can hear, hoping that someday her faithless groom will finally arrive to claim the dance he promised her so long ago. For those fortunate enough to witness her phantom wedding, the experience serves as both a blessing and a warning that love is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of creating both the greatest joy and the most enduring sorrow. Let's move to our sixth story, and this one will prove that sometimes the most innocent voices can carry the darkest secrets. Imagine staying in a charming country inn, where the staff prides itself on hospitality, and the basement houses a cozy tavern, where guests gather for evening drinks. Now imagine discovering that the basement also houses something else. A child's voice that echoes through the stone walls, asking questions that no living child should know to ask, and seeking attention from guests who have no idea they're conversing with someone who died decades ago. Professor Elizabeth Harper was a folklore researcher from the University of Kentucky who specialized in Appalachian ghost stories and regional supernatural traditions. At 55, she had spent over 2 decades collecting oral histories from rural communities, documenting the ways that ghost stories reflected cultural values and historical traumas. Her latest research project focused on haunted hospitality establishments in Kentucky, and the Boone Tavern Hotel in Berea had been recommended to her by several colleagues as a location with particularly rich supernatural folklore. The Boone Tavern had been operating since 1909, originally built to provide accommodations for visitors to Berea College and to showcase the traditional crafts and hospitality of Appalachian culture. The hotel's basement tavern was famous throughout the region for its stone walls, low ceilings, and authentic atmosphere that transported guests back to the early days of Kentucky settlement. Professor Harper had booked a 3-night stay in November 2017, planning to interview staff members and longtime guests about any supernatural experiences associated with the property. When Professor Harper arrived at the Boone Tavern on a cold Thursday afternoon, she was immediately charmed by the building's rustic elegance and warm hospitality. The staff members were knowledgeable about the hotel's history and eager to share stories about famous guests and notable events that had taken place over the decades. The basement tavern was exactly as she had imagined. A cozy space with exposed stone walls, wooden beams, and the kind of intimate atmosphere that encouraged conversation and storytelling. That evening, Professor Harper settled into the basement tavern with her notebook and digital recorder, hoping to strike up conversations with other guests about local folklore and supernatural traditions. The tavern was moderately busy, with a mix of hotel guests and local residents enjoying drinks and the warm atmosphere. Professor Harper ordered a glass of wine and positioned herself at a corner table where she could observe the room and listen for interesting conversations. Around 9 o'clock, as the tavern began to quiet down and some guests started returning to their rooms, Professor Harper became aware of a child's voice coming from somewhere in the basement. At first, she assumed that a family with children was staying at the hotel, and that the voice was carrying through the ventilation system or thin walls. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that the voice seemed to be coming from within the tavern itself, though she could see no children in the room. The voice belonged to a young boy, probably around 8 or 9 years old, and he was speaking in the distinctive accent and speech patterns of rural Kentucky. What made the voice particularly unsettling was not just its disembodied nature, but the content of what the boy was saying. He seemed to be asking questions about the other guests in the tavern, demonstrating knowledge about their personal lives and reasons for visiting that no child should possess. "That lady over there is writing a book about dead people," the voice said clearly, though Professor Harper could see no source for the words. "She wants to know about the ghosts, but she doesn't know that we can see her too." The voice was cheerful and innocent, with the kind of curiosity that was typical of children, but the implications of what he was saying made Professor Harper's skin crawl. Professor Harper looked around the tavern, trying to identify other guests who might be hearing the voice. But everyone seemed to be engaged in their own conversations and activities. A couple at the bar was discussing their plans for the next day. An elderly man was reading a newspaper by the fireplace, and a group of college students was playing cards at a corner table. None of them showed any sign of hearing the disembodied child's voice that was becoming increasingly clear to Professor Harper. "My name is Timmy," the voice continued. And now it seemed to be speaking directly to Professor Harper, though she still couldn't see any source for the words. "I live down here in the basement, and I like to talk to the people who come to visit. Most of them can't hear me, but you can, can't you? You're the lady who studies ghost stories, so you know how to listen to voices like mine." Professor Harper's academic training had taught her to approach supernatural claims with skepticism and scientific methodology. but she couldn't deny the reality of what she was experiencing. The voice was clear and distinct, with personality quirks and speech patterns that suggested a real individual rather than an auditory hallucination. She decided to respond, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the other guests in the tavern. "Hello, Timmy," she whispered. "Can you tell me how long you've been here?" "A really long time," Timmy replied, his voice brightening with excitement at having found someone who could hear him. "I don't remember exactly when I came here, but it was before the big war when all the soldiers went away. I was sick, and my mama brought me here because she thought the doctors could make me better. But I got sicker instead, and then I couldn't leave anymore." Professor Harper realized that Timmy was likely referring to World War II, which would place his death sometime in the 1940s. She continued the conversation, asking gentle questions about his experiences and trying to gather information that might help her understand the nature of his haunting. Timmy was eager to talk, explaining that he spent most of his time in the basement because it was warm and there were always people to watch and listen to. "I like it when people come to the tavern," Timmy explained. "They tell stories and laugh, and sometimes they talk about sad things too. I try to help them feel better, but most of them can't hear me. You're special because you listen to ghost stories, so you know how to hear voices from people like me who aren't alive anymore." As the conversation continued, Professor Harper became increasingly disturbed by Timmy's knowledge about the other guests in the tavern. He accurately described the couple at the bar as newlyweds who were having their first fight, mentioned that the elderly man by the fireplace was grieving the recent death of his wife, and revealed that one of the college students was worried about failing an important exam. The information was specific and personal, suggesting that Timmy had been observing and listening to people's private conversations for decades. "How do you know so much about the people who come here?" Professor Harper asked. "I watch and listen," Timmy replied matter-of-factly. "When you're dead, you can see things that living people try to hide. People think their secrets are safe, but ghosts can see right through the pretending. The sad man over there is crying inside because his wife died last month. And the college boy is scared because he might have to leave school if he fails his test." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Timmy sharing details about the hotel's history, previous guests he had encountered, and his observations about human nature gathered from decades of invisible observation. He spoke with the innocent curiosity of a child, but his insights into human psychology and behavior were disturbingly mature. Professor Harper began to understand that Timmy's haunting was not just a residual presence, but an active, intelligent spirit who had been learning and growing through his supernatural existence. "Do you ever get lonely?" Professor Harper asked. "Sometimes," Timmy admitted, his voice becoming sadder. "I miss my mama, and I wish I could play with other children. But most kids can't see me, and their parents get scared when they start talking to invisible friends. The grown-ups who come here are usually too busy to notice me, except for people like you who study ghost stories." As the evening progressed and the tavern began to empty, Timmy's voice became more urgent, as if he were afraid that Professor Harper would leave and he would be alone again. He began sharing more personal details about his death and his experiences as a spirit, revealing a loneliness and longing that was heartbreaking in its intensity. "I died in one of the rooms upstairs," Timmy explained. "Room 214. My mama held my hand, and I could see her crying, but I couldn't tell her that I was okay. After I died, I tried to go find her, but I couldn't leave the hotel. Something keeps me here, and I don't know how to go away. Professor Harper spent the next 2 days conducting research about the hotel's history, trying to find records of a child named Timmy who had died at the Boone Tavern in the 1940s. Her investigation led her to the Berea College archives, where she discovered a tragic story that confirmed everything Timmy had told her. Timmy Morrison had been brought to the hotel in 1943 by his mother, who had hoped that the mountain air and medical attention available in Berea might help cure his tuberculosis. Instead, the 8-year-old boy had died in room 214 after a 2-week stay, becoming one of many children who succumbed to the disease during that era. The record showed that Timmy's mother, Sarah Morrison, had been devastated by her son's death and had never returned to claim his few belongings. The hotel had kept his toys and clothes for several years before finally donating them to local charities. Professor Harper realized that Timmy's spirit had been trapped in the hotel for over 70 years, watching guests come and go while longing for the mother who had never returned for him. On her final night at the Boone Tavern, Professor Harper returned to the basement tavern to say goodbye to Timmy. The conversation was emotional and difficult, as the spirit child pleaded with her not to leave and begged her to find a way to help him reunite with his mother. Professor Harper explained gently that his mother had likely died many years ago, but that she was probably waiting for him in whatever realm spirits go to when they finally find peace. "How do I get there?" Timmy asked, his voice small and frightened. "I've been trying to leave for so long, but I don't know how. I think I'm supposed to go somewhere else, but I'm scared to go alone." Professor Harper, drawing on her knowledge of folklore and supernatural traditions, suggested that Timmy might need to forgive himself for dying and leaving his mother behind. She explained that many spirits become trapped by guilt or unfinished business, and that finding peace often requires letting go of earthly attachments and accepting the transition to whatever comes after death. The conversation marked the last time Professor Harper heard Timmy's voice clearly, though she sensed his presence during her final morning at the hotel. When she checked out, she left a small toy car on the front desk, with a note asking the staff to place it in room 214, hoping that the gesture might provide some comfort to the lonely spirit child. Professor Harper included Timmy's story in her research about haunted hospitality establishments, but she changed identifying details to protect the hotel's reputation and Timmy's privacy. The experience had a profound impact on her understanding of childhood spirits and the ways that trauma can bind souls to earthly locations. She realized that some hauntings are not about fear or malevolence, but about love, loss, and the desperate need for human connection that transcends death. The Boone Tavern continues to operate today, and staff members occasionally report hearing a child's voice in the basement tavern, though most attribute it to acoustics or imagination. Guests who are sensitive to supernatural presences sometimes mention feeling watched or hearing whispered conversations that seem to come from nowhere. For those who take the time to listen carefully, Timmy's voice can still be heard on quiet evenings, sharing his observations about human nature and asking the eternal question that all lost children ask: "When is my mama coming back for me?" The story serves as a reminder that not all ghosts are frightening. Some are simply children who died too young and are still waiting for someone to help them find their way home. Let's move to our 7th story. And this one will show you that some guests never truly check out, even when their earthly lives have ended decades ago. Picture yourself staying at a grand mountain resort where luxury and elegance have attracted the wealthy and powerful for over a century. Now imagine discovering that the hotel's most distinguished guests from the past still roam the halls, hosting their own eternal social gatherings and occasionally inviting the living to join their otherworldly soirees. Margaret Sinclair was a luxury travel writer for Condé Nast Traveler, who specialized in reviewing America's most prestigious historic hotels. At 38, she had stayed in hundreds of five-star properties around the world. But she had never experienced anything quite like the assignment that brought her to the Mount Washington Resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in February 2020. The magazine had commissioned her to write a feature article about winter luxury travel, and the Mount Washington Resort's reputation for elegance and old-world charm made it the perfect centerpiece for her story. The Mount Washington Resort had been the crown jewel of New Hampshire's White Mountains since 1902, when it opened as the largest wooden structure in New England. The hotel had hosted presidents, royalty, and celebrities throughout its long history, including the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 that established the post-war international monetary system. The resort's grand ballroom, sweeping verandas, and panoramic mountain views had made it a destination for America's elite for over a century. Margaret arrived at the resort on a snowy Thursday evening, immediately impressed by the hotel's imposing facade and the warm glow of lights reflecting off the snow-covered grounds. The lobby was a masterpiece of Edwardian architecture, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and period furnishings that transported guests back to the golden age of luxury travel. She had specifically requested room 314, which the concierge had described as one of the hotel's most historically significant accommodations, having housed numerous notable guests over the decades. Room 314 was everything Margaret had hoped for. Spacious and elegantly appointed with period antiques, a marble fireplace, and large windows that offered breathtaking views of the presidential range. The room's history was documented in a leather-bound guest book that previous occupants had signed, including several entries from European nobility who had visited during the resort's early decades. One name that appeared repeatedly was Princess Caroline Foster, a minor member of European royalty who had made the Mount Washington Resort her American residence during the 1920s and 30s. Based on the hotel's documented history, Princess Caroline had been a captivating personality. A prosperous widow who had escaped Europe following World War I and positioned herself as a notable figure in American upper-class circles. She had kept a permanent residence at the Mount Washington Resort for more than 15 years, organizing grand celebrations and social events that drew famous personalities, government officials, and other members of the global aristocracy. The princess had passed away in room 314 in 1936, officially from natural circumstances, though some suggested quietly that she had ended her own existence upon discovering the emergence of totalitarian movements in her homeland. Margaret spent her first day at the resort exploring the property and conducting interviews with staff members about the hotel's history and notable guests. Several employees mentioned Princess Caroline with a mixture of reverence and unease, describing her as a legendary figure whose presence could still be felt throughout the hotel. The concierge showed Margaret photographs of the princess from the hotel's archives, a strikingly beautiful woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, always dressed in the height of 1920s fashion. That evening, Margaret settled into room 314 to work on her article, surrounded by the elegant atmosphere that had attracted guests for over a century. The room was quiet and peaceful, with only the sound of wind through the mountain pines and the distant murmur of other guests in the hallways. As she typed on her laptop, Margaret found herself repeatedly drawn to examine the antique furnishings and imagine the conversations and gatherings that had taken place in this very space decades ago. Around midnight, as Margaret was preparing for bed, she heard the sound of laughter coming from the hallway outside her room. At first, she assumed it was other guests returning from the hotel's bar or restaurant. But the laughter had a quality that seemed out of place in a modern hotel. It was refined and musical, with the kind of sophisticated charm that belonged to a different era. The voices spoke in accents that sounded vaguely European, mixed with the precise diction of American high society from the early 20th century. Margaret opened her door to investigate, expecting to see a group of guests in the hallway. But the corridor was empty and dimly lit by reproduction sconces that cast long shadows on the carpeted floor. The laughter continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once, as if a party were taking place in several rooms simultaneously. Most puzzling of all, the voices seemed to be discussing topics that made no sense in the context of 2020. References to prohibition, the stock market crash, and European political situations that had been resolved decades ago. As Margaret stood in her doorway, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, one voice became clearer than the others. A woman speaking with a refined European accent and an air of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being the center of attention. The voice was warm and charming, but there was also something commanding about it, as if the speaker were used to having her wishes obeyed without question. "My dear guests," the voice said clearly, "I do hope you're enjoying our little gathering. It's so wonderful to have such distinguished company here at our mountain retreat. Please do join us in the Blue Room for champagne and conversation. We have so much to discuss, and the evening is still young." Margaret realized with growing amazement that she was hearing Princess Caroline Foster's voice, still hosting parties and social gatherings nearly a century after her death. The phantom parties seemed to be taking place throughout the hotel's upper floors, with guests moving between rooms and engaging in the kind of sophisticated conversation that had made the Mount Washington Resort famous during its golden age. Driven by journalistic curiosity and the desire to understand what she was experiencing, Margaret followed the sounds of the party down the hallway. The voices led her to a section of the hotel that housed several of the larger suites, including what had once been Princess Caroline's permanent residence. As she approached the area, the sounds of the party became more distinct. The clink of champagne glasses, the rustle of silk evening gowns, and the kind of witty conversation that characterized high society gatherings of the 1920s and 30s. Margaret found herself standing outside the door of what the hotel staff had told her was the Blue Room, Princess Caroline's former private salon. The door was closed, but light seemed to be seeping from beneath it, and the sounds of the party were clearly coming from within. As she stood there, trying to decide whether to knock or simply listen, the door opened on its own, revealing a scene that took her breath away. The Blue Room was filled with elegantly dressed people from another era, all engaged in animated conversation while holding crystal champagne flutes and smoking cigarettes in long holders. The men wore white tie and tails, while the women were dressed in beaded gowns and elaborate jewelry that sparkled in the light from crystal chandeliers. The room itself appeared to have been restored to its 1920s splendor, with period furnishings and decorations that were far more elaborate than anything Margaret had seen in the hotel's current configuration. At the center of the gathering stood Princess Caroline Foster herself, exactly as she appeared in the historical photographs, but somehow more vibrant and alive than any picture could capture. She was wearing a stunning silver gown that seemed to shimmer with its own light, and her dark hair was arranged in the fashionable bob style of the era. When she saw Margaret standing in the doorway, the princess smiled warmly and approached with the gracious manner of a perfect hostess. "How delightful," Princess Caroline exclaimed, her voice carrying the same refined European accent that Margaret had heard in the hallway. "We have a new guest joining our little soiree. Please, my dear, do come in and introduce yourself. We were just discussing the most fascinating developments in European politics, and I'm sure you'll have some interesting perspectives to share." Margaret found herself drawn into the room, though she couldn't remember making a conscious decision to enter. The phantom guests welcomed her warmly, engaging her in conversation about topics ranging from art and literature to travel and society gossip. What struck Margaret most was how real and substantial these ghostly figures seemed. She could feel the silk of their clothing when they brushed against her, smell their perfume and cologne, and even taste the champagne that was pressed into her hand by an attentive phantom waiter. The conversation was sophisticated and engaging, with the kind of intellectual discourse that had made Princess Caroline's gatherings legendary during her lifetime. The guests discussed books that had been published decades ago, as if they were current bestsellers, debated political situations that had been resolved before Margaret was born, and shared gossip about celebrities who had been dead for generations. Yet despite the anachronistic nature of their topics, the conversations felt immediate and relevant, as if these phantom socialites existed in their own temporal bubble, where the 1920s and 30s continued indefinitely. Princess Caroline proved to be a fascinating hostess, regaling Margaret with stories about her travels, her experiences in European high society, and her decision to make America her permanent home. She spoke about the Mount Washington resort with obvious affection, describing it as her sanctuary from the troubles of the world and the perfect place to gather interesting people for stimulating conversation. "This hotel has always attracted the most remarkable individuals," the princess explained as she guided Margaret around the room, introducing her to various phantom guests. "Artists, writers, politicians, adventurers, all seeking the same thing we provide here. A refuge from the ordinary world where extraordinary conversations can flourish. Death, I've discovered, is merely another form of travel, and I've chosen to make this my permanent destination." As the evening progressed, Margaret began to understand that she was witnessing more than just a haunting. She was experiencing a supernatural social gathering that had been continuing for decades, with Princess Caroline serving as the eternal hostess for a collection of spirits who had chosen to remain at the resort rather than move on to whatever comes after death. The phantom guests were all individuals who had died at the hotel or had such strong connections to it that they couldn't bear to leave, creating a ghostly society that existed parallel to the world of the living. The party continued until dawn, with Margaret participating in conversations that ranged from profound philosophical discussions to lighthearted gossip about the living guests currently staying at the hotel. She learned that the phantom socialites were well aware of the modern world and often observed contemporary visitors with amusement and curiosity, though they rarely chose to interact with the living as directly as they had with her. As the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, the phantom party began to fade. The ghostly guests started to become translucent, their voices growing fainter as they prepared to return to whatever realm they inhabited during daylight hours. Princess Caroline was the last to fade, taking Margaret's hand in a gesture that felt surprisingly warm and substantial. "Thank you for joining us, my dear. the princess said with genuine warmth. It's been such a pleasure to have someone from your era participate in our little gathering. You're welcome to return any time you're staying at the resort. We're always here, and we do so enjoy meeting interesting people who appreciate good conversation and refined company. Margaret found herself back in her own room as the sun rose over the White Mountains. With only the faint scent of champagne and perfume lingering in the air to prove that her extraordinary experience had been real. She spent the rest of her stay at the Mount Washington Resort researching the history of Princess Caroline and her phantom guests, discovering that many of the people she had met at the party were real historical figures who had died at the hotel or had strong connections to it. The article Margaret eventually wrote for Condé Nast Traveler focused on the Mount Washington Resort's luxury amenities and historical significance. But she included subtle references to the hotel's timeless atmosphere and the sense that distinguished guests from previous eras still influenced the property's unique character. She never explicitly described her encounter with Princess Caroline's phantom party, knowing that such claims would be dismissed as fiction. But she made sure that readers understood the hotel offered experiences that transcended ordinary luxury travel. Margaret returned to the Mount Washington Resort several times over the following years, always requesting room 314 and always hoping for another invitation to Princess Caroline's eternal soiree. Sometimes she heard the distant sounds of phantom parties in the hallways, and occasionally she caught glimpses of elegantly dressed figures from another era. But she was never again invited to participate as directly as she had during that first magical night. The experience changed Margaret's approach to travel writing forever, making her more sensitive to the historical layers that exist in truly great hotels and the ways that the past continues to influence the present in places where significant events have occurred. She understood now that some destinations offer more than just luxury accommodations. They provide access to the accumulated experiences and memories of everyone who has ever found refuge, celebration, or transformation within their walls. The Mount Washington Resort continues to attract luxury travelers from around the world, and Princess Caroline Foster continues to host her phantom gatherings for those fortunate enough to be invited. For guests who are sensitive to supernatural presences, the hotel offers the unique opportunity to experience not just modern luxury, but the timeless elegance of an era when travel was an art form and conversation was the highest form of entertainment. The story serves as a reminder that the most memorable travel experiences often come from unexpected encounters with the past, and that some hotels are more than just places to stay. They are portals to other times and other worlds, where the living and the dead can meet on equal terms and share in the eternal human desire for connection, conversation, and community. Let's move to our 8th story. And this one will make you question whether some college traditions are worth preserving, especially when the participants refuse to let death end the party. Picture yourself staying at a prestigious inn near an Ivy League campus, where the walls have witnessed decades of academic achievement and youthful celebration. Now imagine discovering that some of those celebrations never actually ended, and that phantom fraternity brothers still gather in the hotel's private dining rooms, eternally reliving their glory days while occasionally inviting unsuspecting guests to join their ghostly revelries. Dr. Amanda Richardson was a sociology professor at Columbia University who specialized in studying college social dynamics and fraternity culture. At 43, she had spent her career researching the ways that collegiate traditions shaped young adults and influenced their later lives. In March 2019, she was invited to deliver a guest lecture at Dartmouth College about the evolution of Greek life in American universities. She decided to extend her visit into a weekend research trip, booking a room at the historic Hanover Inn to conduct interviews with alumni and gather material for a book she was writing about fraternity culture in the Ivy League. The Hanover Inn had been serving the Dartmouth community since 1780, making it one of America's oldest continuously operating hotels. The inn's location directly across from the college campus made it a natural gathering place for students, faculty, alumni, and visiting dignitaries. Over the centuries, the hotel had hosted countless celebrations, reunions, and social events that had become part of Dartmouth's rich tradition. The inn's private dining rooms were particularly popular for fraternity and sorority gatherings, providing an elegant setting for formal dinners and ceremonial events. Dr. Richardson arrived at the Hanover Inn on a cold Friday evening in March. Immediately struck by the building's colonial charm and its obvious connection to the college across the street. The lobby was filled with Dartmouth memorabilia, including photographs of famous alumni, vintage college pennants, and display cases containing artifacts from the school's long history. Her room on the third floor offered a perfect view of the campus quad, where she could see students hurrying between buildings despite the late winter snow that was beginning to fall. That evening, Dr. Richardson attended a faculty dinner in one of the inn's private dining rooms, where she was introduced to several professors and administrators who shared her interest in collegiate social structures. The conversation was stimulating and informative, providing valuable insights for her research. After the dinner ended around 10 o'clock, Dr. Richardson returned to her room to review her notes and prepare for the interviews she had scheduled for the following day. Around midnight, as Dr. Richardson was working at the small desk in her room, she began to hear sounds coming from somewhere else in the hotel. The kind of boisterous laughter and animated conversation that was typical of college social gatherings. At first, she assumed it was current Dartmouth students celebrating in one of the inn's common areas. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that the voices had a quality that seemed out of place for modern college students. The laughter was hearty and masculine, with the kind of privileged confidence that characterized elite social circles from an earlier era. The voices spoke with the precise diction and formal vocabulary that had been common among educated young men in the early to mid-20th century, using slang and expressions that hadn't been popular for decades. Most intriguingly, the conversation seemed to focus on college experiences and social events that referenced Dartmouth traditions from the 1940s and 1950s. Dr. Richardson's academic curiosity was immediately piqued. As a researcher who specialized in fraternity culture, she was familiar with the evolution of college social traditions and the ways that different generations of students had expressed their collegiate identity. The voices she was hearing seemed to represent a specific era in Dartmouth's history, and she wondered if she might be overhearing some kind of historical reenactment or alumni gathering focused on preserving old traditions. Deciding to investigate, Dr. Richardson left her room and followed the sounds through the inn's corridors. The voices led her toward the hotel's collection of private dining rooms on the second floor, spaces that she knew were frequently used for fraternity events and alumni gatherings. As she approached the area, the sounds of the party became more distinct. She could hear the clink of glasses, the scraping of chairs, and the kind of ritualistic chanting that was associated with fraternity ceremonies. The sounds seemed to be coming from the Eleazar Wheelock Room, one of the inn's most prestigious private dining spaces, named after Dartmouth's founder. Dr. Richardson could see light seeping from beneath the closed door, and the party sounds were definitely emanating from within. She approached the door cautiously, unsure whether she should interrupt what might be a private alumni event. But her researcher's instincts compelled her to at least try to observe what was happening. As Dr. Richardson stood outside the door, She heard one voice rise above the others. A young man speaking with a kind of theatrical authority that suggested he was leading some kind of ceremony or ritual. His words were formal and ceremonial, referencing fraternity traditions and brotherhood bonds in language that sounded like it came from official Greek life literature from decades past. "Brothers," the voice declared, "we gather tonight as we have gathered for generations, bound by the sacred ties of brotherhood that transcend the boundaries of time and mortality. Though our earthly days at Dartmouth have ended, our commitment to each other and to the traditions of our beloved fraternity remains eternal and unbreakable." Dr. Richardson realized with growing amazement that she was listening to what appeared to be a fraternity meeting or ceremony, but one that was being conducted by participants who claimed to be dead. The implications were staggering. If what she was hearing was real, then she had stumbled upon a supernatural gathering of deceased Dartmouth students who were continuing their fraternity activities in the afterlife. The ceremonial voice continued, welcoming new members to what he called the Eternal Brotherhood, and describing the privileges and responsibilities that came with membership in their ghostly organization. Other voices joined in, reciting what sounded like fraternity pledges and oaths that had been modified to reflect their supernatural status. The entire gathering had the formal structure and ritualistic elements that Dr. Richardson recognized from her research into fraternity culture, but adapted for participants who were no longer among the living. Driven by academic curiosity and the desire to document this extraordinary phenomenon, Dr. Richardson decided to knock on the door. The sounds from within the room immediately stopped, creating a silence that was almost more unsettling than the phantom party had been. After a moment, footsteps approached the door from the inside, and Dr. Richardson heard the voice that had been leading the ceremony. "Who seeks admission to our gathering?" the voice asked formally, as if following some established protocol for dealing with unexpected visitors. "My name is Dr. Amanda Richardson," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I'm a professor studying fraternity culture, and I'm very interested in learning about your organization and traditions." The door opened slowly, revealing a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s, dressed in the kind of formal attire that had been popular among college students in the 1940s. A dark suit, white shirt, and narrow tie. His appearance was somehow both substantial and translucent, as if he existed in a state between the physical and spiritual worlds. Behind him, Dr. Richardson could see a room filled with similarly dressed young men, all looking at her with expressions of curiosity and mild amusement. "How fascinating," the young man said with a smile that was both charming and slightly unsettling. "It's been many years since we've had a living scholar express interest in our activities. Please do come in and join us. I'm Charles Whitman, class of 1943, and I serve as the current president of our Eternal chapter." Dr. Richardson entered the room, immediately struck by the sight of approximately 20 young men arranged around a formal dining table set with crystal glasses and silver serving pieces that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The room itself appeared to have been restored to its 1940s appearance, with period furnishings and decorations that were far more elaborate than the inn's current decor. Most remarkably, all of the phantom fraternity brothers appeared to be frozen at the age they had been when they died, creating a gathering of eternally youthful spirits who had maintained their collegiate enthusiasm for decades. Charles Whitman introduced Dr. Richardson to the other members of their supernatural fraternity, each of whom had died during or shortly after their time at Dartmouth. Some had been killed in World War II. Others had died in accidents or from illnesses. But all had chosen to remain connected to their college experience rather than moving on to whatever comes after death. They had formed what they called the eternal chapter, continuing their fraternity activities and traditions in the afterlife, while occasionally recruiting new members from among the spirits of deceased Dartmouth students. "We meet here every month," Charles explained as he offered Dr. Richardson a seat at their phantom banquet table. The Hanover Inn has always been central to Dartmouth's social life, and it provides the perfect setting for our continued brotherhood activities. We conduct business meetings, plan social events, and maintain the traditions that were so important to us during our earthly lives at the college. The Phantom Fraternity brothers were eager to share their experiences with Dr. Richardson, describing the ways that death had changed their perspective on college life and social relationships. They spoke about the bonds of friendship that had sustained them through the transition from life to death, and the comfort they found in maintaining familiar rituals and traditions in their supernatural existence. Their insights into fraternity culture were profound and moving, offering perspectives that no living researcher could access. "Brotherhood doesn't end with graduation or even with death," explained Robert Morrison, class of 1947, who had died in a car accident shortly after completing his degree. "The connections we formed during our college years were so strong that they've sustained us through decades of supernatural existence. We've learned that the most meaningful aspects of fraternity life, loyalty, friendship, mutual support, are eternal values that transcend physical existence." As the evening progressed, Dr. Richardson participated in their phantom meeting, observing rituals and ceremonies that had been preserved exactly as they had been performed in the 1940s and 1950s. The ghostly fraternity brothers maintained detailed records of their activities, including minutes from meetings dating back decades and membership rolls that documented every spirit who had joined their eternal chapter. They had even established scholarship funds for living Dartmouth students, using supernatural means to influence lottery drawings and investment outcomes to generate money for their philanthropic activities. The most remarkable aspect of the gathering was the way these phantom fraternity brothers had adapted their traditions to accommodate their supernatural status while preserving the essential elements that had made their brotherhood meaningful during their lives. They had created new rituals for welcoming deceased alumni into their eternal chapter, established protocols for interacting with the living world, and developed a governance structure that allowed them to maintain their organization across decades of supernatural existence. "We've discovered that the values we learned in our fraternity, honor, integrity, service to others, are just as relevant in death as they were in life," Charles explained as the meeting began to wind down. "We use our supernatural abilities to help current Dartmouth students influence positive outcomes for the college and preserve the traditions that made our own college experience so meaningful." As dawn approached, the phantom fraternity brothers began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as they prepared to return to whatever realm they inhabited during daylight hours. Charles Whitman was the last to disappear, shaking Dr. Richardson's hand in a gesture that felt surprisingly warm and solid despite his ghostly nature. "Thank you for joining us tonight, Professor," he said with genuine warmth. "It's been an honor to share our story with someone who understands the importance of fraternity traditions and social bonds. You're welcome to attend our meetings anytime you're visiting Dartmouth. We gather here on the first Friday of every month, and we always enjoy meeting scholars who appreciate the deeper meanings of collegiate brotherhood." Dr. Richardson found herself back in the hotel corridor as the sun rose over the Dartmouth campus. with only the faint scent of pipe tobacco and aged whiskey lingering in the air, to prove that her extraordinary experience had been real. She spent the rest of her weekend at Dartmouth researching the histories of the young men she had met, discovering that all of them were real individuals who had attended the college and died under the circumstances they had described. The experience fundamentally changed Dr. Richardson's understanding of fraternity culture and the lasting impact of collegiate social bonds. She realized that the relationships formed during college years could be so powerful that they transcended death itself, creating communities that continue to exist and function in supernatural realms. Her subsequent research focused on the spiritual and psychological dimensions of fraternity brotherhood, exploring the ways that shared rituals and traditions create bonds that can survive even the ultimate separation of death. Dr. Richardson returned to the Hanover Inn several times over the following years, always scheduling her visits to coincide with the first Friday of the month. Sometimes she was invited to join the phantom fraternity meetings, and sometimes she simply observed from a distance. But she always came away with new insights into the enduring power of collegiate social bonds and the ways that meaningful traditions can create connections that last for eternity. The Hanover Inn continues to serve the Dartmouth community, and Charles Whitman's Eternal Chapter continues to meet in the Elizar Wheelock Room, preserving fraternity traditions that span multiple generations and maintaining brotherhood bonds that have proven stronger than death itself. For guests who are sensitive to supernatural presences, the inn offers the unique opportunity to witness the continuation of college traditions in their purest form, unmarked by the cynicism and commercialization that sometimes affect modern Greek life. The story serves as a testament to the enduring power of friendship, tradition, and shared values to create communities that transcend the boundaries between life and death, and to the ways that meaningful collegiate experiences can shape individuals so profoundly that they choose to preserve those connections for eternity. Let's move to our 9th story, and this one will prove that some hotel owners take customer service so seriously that they refuse to let death interfere with their dedication to guest satisfaction. Picture yourself staying at one of Boston's most prestigious historic hotels, where the founder's commitment to hospitality was so profound that he continues to personally ensure every guest's comfort, even though he's been dead for over a century. Now imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find this ghostly proprietor standing at the foot of your bed, clipboard in hand, asking if everything is to your satisfaction. Thomas Bradley was a hotel management consultant from Seattle who specialized in helping historic properties maintain their reputation for excellence while adapting to modern hospitality standards. At 51, he had worked with luxury hotels across the country, but he had never encountered a property quite like the Omni Parker House in Boston, where he had been hired to conduct a comprehensive operational review in October 2021. The hotel's management had specifically requested his expertise in maintaining traditional service standards while implementing contemporary efficiency measures. The Omni Parker House had been a Boston landmark since 1855, when it was founded by Harvey Parker, a visionary hotelier who revolutionized American hospitality with his attention to detail and commitment to guest satisfaction. Parker had personally overseen every aspect of the hotel's operation during his lifetime, from the quality of the linens to the temperature of the dining rooms. His dedication to excellence had made the Parker House one of America's most prestigious hotels, hosting presidents, celebrities, and dignitaries who expected nothing less than perfection during their stays. Thomas arrived at the Parker House on a crisp Tuesday evening, immediately impressed by the hotel's elegant lobby and the obvious pride that the staff took in maintaining the property's historic character. The concierge showed him to room 1012 explaining that it had been one of Harvey Parker's favorite guest rooms and offered an excellent example of the hotel's commitment to preserving its original charm while providing modern amenities. The room was beautifully appointed with period furnishings and reproductions of 19th century decor that created an atmosphere of timeless elegance. During his first day of evaluation, Thomas interviewed staff members throughout the hotel, from housekeeping and maintenance to front desk and restaurant personnel. What struck him most was the consistent way that employees described feeling watched and evaluated, as if someone were constantly monitoring their performance and holding them to impossibly high standards. Several staff members mentioned experiencing an unseen presence that seemed to observe their work, particularly during night shifts when the hotel was quieter and the atmosphere more conducive to supernatural encounters. "It's like he's still here, checking on everything," explained Maria Santos, the head of housekeeping, who had worked at the Parker House for over 20 years. "Sometimes I'll be cleaning a room, and I'll get the feeling that someone is standing behind me, watching to make sure I'm doing everything properly. When I turn around, there's no one there. But I can sense disapproval if I've missed something or haven't met the standards he would have expected." Thomas initially dismissed these accounts as the kind of folklore that naturally develops around historic properties. But as he continued his evaluation, he began to notice subtle signs that suggested something unusual was indeed happening at the Parker House. Elevators would stop at floors where no one had pressed the call button. Room temperatures would adjust themselves without any input from the climate control system, and staff members would find their work areas mysteriously reorganized according to more efficient arrangements that no living person had implemented. On his third night at the hotel, Thomas was awakened around 2 o'clock in the morning by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his room. The footsteps were deliberate and purposeful, with the measured pace of someone conducting a thorough inspection. Thomas assumed it was hotel security making their rounds. But the footsteps stopped directly outside his door and remained there for several minutes, as if someone were listening or observing. Thomas got out of bed and approached the door, looking through the peephole to see who was in the hallway. To his surprise, he saw a figure standing directly in front of his room. A middle-aged man in formal 19th century attire, including a dark suit, white shirt, and the kind of precise grooming that had been fashionable among successful businessmen in the 1800s. The man was holding what appeared to be a clipboard or notebook, and he seemed to be making notes while studying Thomas's door. The figure matched historical descriptions and photographs of Harvey Parker himself, a distinguished gentleman with carefully groomed facial hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that suggested he was accustomed to running a successful business. Most remarkably, despite being clearly visible through the peephole, the figure had a translucent quality that made it obvious he was not among the living. As Thomas watched in fascination, Harvey Parker's ghost looked up directly at the peephole, as if he knew he was being observed. The phantom hotelier smiled politely and raised his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and acknowledgement, then turned and continued down the hallway, his footsteps resuming their measured pace as he continued what appeared to be his nightly inspection of the hotel. Thomas opened his door and stepped into the hallway, hoping to observe Harvey Parker's supernatural rounds more closely. The ghostly proprietor was moving systematically from room to room, pausing at each door to make notes on his phantom clipboard. Occasionally, he would test door handles to ensure they were properly secured, or adjust thermostats in the hallway to maintain optimal temperature for guest comfort. His attention to detail was extraordinary, reflecting the same commitment to excellence that had made the Parker House famous during his lifetime. "Good evening, Mr. Bradley," Harvey Parker said pleasantly as he noticed Thomas observing him. His voice had the refined accent and formal speech patterns of educated 19th century Americans. But there was also a warmth and genuine concern that immediately put Thomas at ease. "I do hope your stay with us has been satisfactory. I was just conducting my nightly inspection to ensure that all of our guests are comfortable and that our staff is maintaining the standards of service that have made the Parker House Boston's premier hotel." Thomas found himself engaged in conversation with the ghostly hotelier, discussing various aspects of hotel operations and guest satisfaction, with someone who had literally invented many of the hospitality practices that were still considered standard in the industry. Harvey Parker's insights into hotel management were profound and practical. Reflecting over a century of supernatural observation and the accumulated wisdom of someone who had dedicated his entire existence to perfecting the art of hospitality. Excellence in hospitality is not merely about providing comfortable accommodations, Harvey Parker explained as he continued his inspection, with Thomas walking alongside him. It requires anticipating guests' needs before they are expressed, maintaining standards that exceed expectations, and creating an atmosphere where every individual feels valued and cared for. These principles are as relevant today as they were when I first opened this establishment in 1855. As they moved through the hotel together, Harvey Parker demonstrated his continued involvement in the property's daily operations. He showed Thomas how he had been subtly influencing staff behavior to maintain service standards, adjusting environmental controls to ensure guest comfort, and even intervening in situations where guests were experiencing problems that the living staff hadn't noticed. His supernatural abilities allowed him to monitor every aspect of the hotel's operation simultaneously, creating a level of quality control that would be impossible for any living manager to achieve. I've observed that modern hotel management often focuses on efficiency and cost reduction at the expense of personal service, Harvey Parker noted as they paused outside the hotel's restaurant. While I understand the economic pressures that contemporary hoteliers face, I believe that true hospitality requires a personal touch that cannot be automated or systematized. That's why I continue to oversee operations here, to ensure that the Parker House maintains the standards of service that our guests deserve. Thomas learned that Harvey Parker's ghost had been actively involved in the hotel's management for over a century, working behind the scenes to maintain the property's reputation for excellence. The phantom proprietor had influenced hiring decisions by creating favorable impressions of candidates who demonstrated genuine commitment to hospitality, had prevented accidents and security issues through supernatural intervention, and had even influenced the hotel's financial success by ensuring that guests had experiences that encouraged positive reviews and repeat visits. The hotel industry has changed dramatically since my time, Harvey Parker acknowledged. But the fundamental principles of hospitality remain constant. Guests want to feel welcomed, comfortable, and valued, regardless of whether they're staying in a 19th century inn or a modern resort. My role is to ensure that these timeless values are preserved and practiced, even as the methods of hospitality continue to evolve. The conversation continued for several hours, with Harvey Parker sharing insights about hotel management that Thomas had never encountered in any textbook or professional development program. The ghostly proprietor's perspective on hospitality was both historical and contemporary, reflecting his unique position as someone who had witnessed the evolution of the industry while maintaining his original commitment to excellence. As dawn approached, Harvey Parker began to fade, his form becoming translucent as he prepared to return to whatever realm he inhabited during daylight hours. Before disappearing entirely, He handed Thomas a business card that appeared to be made of the same ethereal material as his clipboard. Elegant and substantial, but clearly not of this world. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions about hotel operations or if you notice any areas where our service standards could be improved. Harvey Parker said with the same professional courtesy he had shown to guests during his lifetime. I'm always available to discuss hospitality matters with fellow professionals who share my commitment to excellence. Thomas found himself back in his room as the sun rose over Boston. With only the phantom business card and the lingering scent of 19th century cologne to prove that his extraordinary encounter had been real. The business card bore Harvey Parker's name and the title Founder and Eternal Proprietor, along with contact information that included both earthly and supernatural methods of communication. The experience fundamentally changed Thomas's approach to hotel management consulting. He realized that the most successful historic properties were those that had maintained a connection to their founding principles and the vision of their original creators. His subsequent recommendations for the Parker House focused on preserving the personal touch and attention to detail that Harvey Parker had established, while implementing modern systems that supported rather than replaced the human elements of hospitality. Thomas's final report praised the Parker House for maintaining service standards that exceeded industry benchmarks, noting that the property's commitment to excellence seemed to be embedded in its very foundation. He recommended that management continue to emphasize personal service and attention to detail, suggesting that these traditional values were the hotel's greatest competitive advantage in an increasingly automated industry. The Omni Parker House continues to operate as one of Boston's premier hotels, and Harvey Parker continues his nightly inspections, ensuring that every guest receives the level of service that has made the property famous for over a century and a half. Staff members have learned to work with their supernatural supervisor, understanding that his presence is a blessing rather than a burden, a guarantee that their hotel maintains standards of excellence that are literally otherworldly. For guests who are sensitive to supernatural presences, staying at the Parker House offers the unique opportunity to experience hospitality that is personally overseen by the man who revolutionized American hotel service. Harvey Parker's continued involvement in the property's operations serves as a testament to the power of dedication and the ways that true commitment to excellence can transcend even death itself. The story reminds us that the best hotels are more than just places to stay. They are institutions where the vision and values of their founders continue to influence every aspect of the guest experience, creating traditions of service that span generations and ensure that hospitality remains a personal art rather than merely a business transaction. Let's move to our 10th story. And this one will show you that some hotel founders refuse to let death end their commitment to creating the perfect guest experience. Picture yourself staying at one of America's most famous haunted hotels, where the original owner's passion for hospitality was so intense that he continues to personally greet guests over a century after his death. Now imagine checking into your room only to discover that your welcoming committee includes not just the living staff, but the ghostly proprietors who built this legendary establishment and still consider every visitor their personal responsibility. Jennifer Walsh was a paranormal investigator and documentary filmmaker from Denver who had spent 15 years researching supernatural phenomena at historic locations across the American West. At 39, she had investigated hundreds of allegedly haunted sites, but she had never encountered a location quite like the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, where she had come in September 2022 to film a documentary about the hotel's famous supernatural residents. The Stanley's reputation as one of America's most haunted hotels had made it a destination for ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. But Jennifer was interested in documenting the more subtle and personal aspects of the hauntings that occurred there. The Stanley Hotel had been built in 1909 by Freeland Oscar Stanley, the inventor of the Stanley steamer automobile, who had come to Colorado seeking treatment for his tuberculosis. Stanley fell in love with the mountain air and spectacular scenery of Estes Park, deciding to build a grand hotel that would attract wealthy visitors from across the country to experience the healing properties of the Colorado Rockies. The hotel's elegant Georgian architecture and luxurious amenities made it an immediate success, establishing it as one of the premier resort destinations in the American West. Jennifer arrived at the Stanley Hotel on a crisp Thursday afternoon, immediately struck by the building's imposing presence against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. The hotel's white colonial facade and red tile roof created a striking contrast with the rugged landscape, and the sweeping views from the property were breathtaking. She had specifically requested room 217, which was famous for its paranormal activity and had been the inspiration for Stephen King's novel The Shining after his stay there in the 1970s. Room 217 was elegantly appointed with period furnishings that reflected the hotel's early 20th century origins, including antique furniture, vintage wallpaper, and reproductions of fixtures that would have been familiar to guests during the Stanley's golden age. The room's large windows offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains, and Jennifer could understand why F.O. Stanley had been so captivated by the location that he had dedicated his fortune to creating this mountain paradise. During her first evening at the hotel, Jennifer set up her recording equipment and began documenting the atmosphere and history of room 217. She had brought sophisticated audio and video equipment designed to capture subtle paranormal phenomena, including electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and digital voice recorders that could pick up sounds beyond the range of human hearing. Her goal was to create a documentary that went beyond the sensational ghost stories typically associated with the Stanley, focusing instead on the more nuanced and personal aspects of the supernatural experiences that occurred there. Around 10 o'clock that evening, as Jennifer was reviewing her initial recordings, she began to notice subtle changes in the room's atmosphere. The temperatures seemed to drop several degrees, and her electromagnetic field detectors started registering fluctuations that suggested the presence of some kind of energy that wasn't visible to the naked eye. Most intriguingly, her audio equipment began picking up what sounded like distant conversation, as if people were talking in another part of the hotel, though the voices seemed to be coming from within room 217 itself. Jennifer increased the sensitivity on her recording equipment and began to make out individual voices engaged in what appeared to be a polite social conversation. The voices had the formal speech patterns and refined accents that were characteristic of educated Americans from the early 1900s, and they seemed to be discussing topics related to hotel management, guest satisfaction, and the challenges of operating a luxury resort in a remote mountain location. As Jennifer listened more carefully, she began to distinguish between different speakers: an older man with an authoritative voice who seemed to be leading the conversation, and a woman with a cultured accent who was contributing observations about hospitality and guest services. The conversation was sophisticated and businesslike, focusing on practical matters related to running a successful hotel. But there was also an underlying warmth and genuine concern for guest welfare that suggested these were people who took personal pride in their hospitality. "My dear Flora," the male voice said clearly, I do believe our latest guest is one of those modern investigators who study supernatural phenomena. How fascinating that people now travel specifically to encounter spirits like ourselves. In our day, such experiences were considered quite private and personal matters. Jennifer realized with growing excitement that she was listening to F.O. Stanley and his wife Flora, the hotel's founders, discussing her presence and her purpose for visiting. The implications were extraordinary. Not only were the Stanley spirits still present in the hotel they had created, but they were actively aware of and interested in their contemporary guests. "Indeed, Oscar," Flora Stanley replied, her voice carrying the refined elegance of a woman who had been accustomed to moving in the highest social circles. "I've been observing her equipment and methodology, and I must say I'm impressed by the scientific approach she's taking to documenting our presence. It's quite different from the sensational ghost hunters who usually visit us, shouting questions and demanding dramatic manifestations." Jennifer decided to respond directly to the conversation she was overhearing, speaking aloud to the apparently empty room while her recording equipment continued to capture everything that was happening. "Mr. and Mrs. Stanley," she said respectfully, "I'm honored to be staying in your beautiful hotel, and I would be delighted to speak with you about your experiences here. I'm creating a documentary that focuses on the personal stories behind paranormal phenomena, and I would love to learn about your continued connection to this place." The response was immediate and gracious. The temperature in the room seemed to warm slightly, and Jennifer's electromagnetic field detectors registered a significant spike in activity. Most remarkably, the voices became clearer and more distinct, as if the Stanleys had moved closer to her location and were now speaking directly to her rather than about her. "How delightful!" F.O. Stanley exclaimed, his voice now clearly audible without the need for electronic amplification. "It's been many years since we've had the opportunity to speak directly with a guest about our hotel and our experiences here. Please, my dear, make yourself comfortable, and we'll be happy to share our story with you." What followed was the most extraordinary interview Jennifer had ever conducted. F.O. and Flora Stanley proved to be charming and articulate subjects, eager to discuss their lives, their decision to build the hotel, and their experiences as spirits who had chosen to remain connected to their earthly creation rather than moving on to whatever comes after death. They spoke with obvious pride about the hotel's history and their continued involvement in its operations, describing the ways they had influenced events and helped maintain the property's reputation for excellence. "Building this hotel was the greatest achievement of my life," F.O. Stanley explained, his voice filled with the same passion and enthusiasm that had driven him to create his mountain resort over a century earlier. The location, the architecture, the attention to every detail of guest comfort. Everything was designed to create a perfect retreat where people could escape the pressures of modern life and reconnect with the natural beauty of the Colorado mountains. Flora Stanley added her own perspectives on hospitality and the social aspects of running a luxury hotel, describing the elaborate parties and gatherings they had hosted during the hotel's early years. She spoke about the famous guests who had stayed at the Stanley, including celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who had sought the same mountain refuge that had originally attracted her husband to Estes Park. "We've discovered that death doesn't end one's connection to the things that were most important in life," Flora explained. "This hotel was our dream made manifest, and our attachment to it has proven stronger than the transition from life to death. We continue to take personal interest in every guest who stays here, and we do our best to ensure that their experience reflects the same standards of excellence that we established during our earthly lives." The Stanleys described their supernatural abilities and the ways they use them to influence the hotel's operations. F.O. Stanley explained that he could manipulate electrical systems, adjust room temperatures, and even influence the behavior of the hotel's staff to ensure that guests received the best possible service. Flora Stanley focused more on the social and emotional aspects of hospitality, describing how she tried to create a welcoming atmosphere and help guests feel comfortable and valued during their stays. We've learned that the most important aspect of hospitality is making people feel genuinely welcome and cared for, Flora noted. Modern hotels often focus on efficiency and standardized service, but we believe that true hospitality requires a personal touch that acknowledges each guest as an individual with unique needs and preferences. As the evening progressed, Jennifer learned about the other spirits who resided at the Stanley Hotel, including former staff members and guests who had chosen to remain connected to the property after their deaths. The Stanleys described a complex supernatural community that existed parallel to the hotel's living operations, with ghostly residents who had their own social structures, relationships, and responsibilities for maintaining the property's spiritual atmosphere. "We're not alone here," F.O. Stanley explained. "Over the decades, we've been joined by others who felt the same connection to this place that we do. Former employees who loved their work here, guests who found peace and healing in these mountains, and even some individuals who simply felt drawn to the energy and beauty of the location. We've created a kind of spiritual family that works together to preserve the hotel's special character." The conversation continued until dawn, with the Stanleys sharing stories about their interactions with famous guests, their observations about changes in society and hospitality over the decades, and their hopes for the hotel's future. They expressed particular appreciation for guests like Jennifer, who approached their presence with respect and genuine curiosity rather than sensationalism or fear. "We're always pleased to meet guests who understand that supernatural phenomena are not necessarily frightening or threatening," Flora Stanley noted. "Our presence here is motivated by love. Love for this place, love for the hospitality industry, and love for the people who choose to visit our mountain retreat. We want every guest to have a positive experience that they'll remember fondly for the rest of their lives." As the sun rose over the Rocky Mountains, casting golden light through the windows of room 217, the Stanleys' voices began to fade, though their presence remained palpable in the room's atmosphere. F.O. Stanley's final words to Jennifer were an invitation to return anytime she wished to continue their conversation, and a request that she portray their story with the dignity and respect that they had tried to maintain throughout their supernatural existence. Jennifer's documentary about the Stanley Hotel became one of her most successful projects, focusing on the personal stories and genuine hospitality that motivated the hotel's supernatural residents rather than sensationalizing their ghostly activities. The film presented the Stanleys as dedicated hoteliers who had found a way to continue their life's work even after death, creating a unique form of hospitality that combined earthly luxury with otherworldly care and attention. The Stanley Hotel continues to attract visitors from around the world, and F.O. and Flora Stanley continue to personally welcome guests who are sensitive to their presence. For those fortunate enough to encounter them, the experience serves as a reminder that the best hospitality comes from genuine care and personal attention, and that some forms of service are so meaningful that they transcend even the boundaries between life and death. The story demonstrates that true hospitality is not just about providing comfortable accommodations, but about creating experiences that touch people's hearts and souls, leaving lasting impressions that can influence both the living and the dead for generations to come. Let's move to our 11th and final story. And this one will leave you questioning whether some love stories are so powerful that they can trap souls in eternal tragedy. Picture the most elegant hotel elevator you've ever seen, with polished brass fixtures and mirrored walls that reflect decades of luxury and sophistication. Now imagine that same elevator becoming a prison for a bride whose wedding day became her last day on earth, and whose desperate search for her lost love has turned a simple ride between floors into a journey through heartbreak that spans over a century. The elevator's shaft. Bride Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a clinical psychologist from Chicago who specialized in treating trauma survivors and had developed a particular interest in how tragic events could create lasting psychological imprints on physical locations. At 45, she had spent her career studying the intersection between psychology and environmental factors. But she had never encountered anything quite like the assignment that brought her to the Grand Palace Hotel in San Francisco in November 2023. The hotel's management had contacted her after a series of disturbing incidents involving their historic elevator system, hoping that her expertise in trauma psychology might help them understand and address what appeared to be supernatural phenomena affecting their guests. The Grand Palace Hotel had been San Francisco's crown jewel since 1875, surviving the Great Earthquake of 1906 and serving as a symbol of the city's resilience and elegance for nearly a century and a half. The hotel's original elevator system had been one of the first hydraulic passenger elevators installed on the West Coast, representing the height of Victorian engineering and luxury. The elevator car itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, with hand-carved wooden panels, beveled mirrors, and brass fixtures that had been polished to a golden gleam for generations. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the Grand Palace on a foggy Tuesday evening, immediately impressed by the hotel's opulent lobby and the obvious care that had been taken to preserve its historic character. The concierge showed her to a suite on the 8th floor, explaining that she would need to use the historic elevator to reach her room, as it was the only way to access the hotel's upper floors. The elevator operator, an elderly gentleman named Thomas who had worked at the hotel for over 30 years, greeted her with a mixture of professionalism and barely concealed unease. "Welcome to the Grand Palace, Doctor Mitchell," Thomas said as he operated the brass controls with practiced precision. "I do hope you'll find your stay comfortable, though I should mention that our elevator has been experiencing some unusual behavior lately. Nothing dangerous, mind you. But some guests have reported strange experiences during their rides." As the elevator rose smoothly toward the 8th floor, Dr. Mitchell noticed an unusual atmosphere in the confined space. The air seemed heavier than normal, and there was a faint scent that reminded her of old perfume and wilted flowers. Most intriguingly, the mirrors that lined the elevator walls seemed to reflect more than just the current occupants. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of additional figures that appeared and disappeared too quickly to focus on clearly. During her first day at the hotel, Dr. Mitchell interviewed staff members and guests who had experienced unusual phenomena in the elevator. The stories were remarkably consistent. People reported seeing a young woman in a wedding dress who appeared in the elevator's mirrors, feeling sudden drops in temperature during rides between certain floors, and hearing the sound of sobbing that seemed to come from within the elevator shaft itself. Most disturbing of all, several guests had reported that the elevator would stop at the 7th floor on its own. The doors would open to reveal an empty hallway, and they would hear a woman's voice pleading for help, finding someone named William. "She's been appearing more frequently over the past few months," explained Margaret Chen, the hotel's guest services manager. who had worked at the Grand Palace for over 15 years. At first, we thought it might be some kind of mechanical issue with the elevator. But our engineers have inspected every component multiple times and found nothing wrong. The phenomena only occur when guests are riding the elevator, never when it's empty or being serviced. Dr. Mitchell learned that the 7th floor had a tragic history that might explain the supernatural activity. In 1924, a young woman named Victoria Ashford had been staying at the hotel while preparing for her wedding to William Thornton, a wealthy businessman from Los Angeles. On the morning of her wedding day, Victoria had taken the elevator down to the lobby to meet her bridal party. But the elevator had malfunctioned between the 7th and 6th floors, trapping her for several hours. By the time rescue workers had freed her from the elevator, Victoria had suffered a fatal heart attack, dying in her wedding dress while calling out for her fiancé who was waiting at the church. The tragedy devastated everyone involved, Margaret continued, showing Dr. Mitchell historical newspaper clippings about the incident. William Thornton was so grief-stricken that he never married, and he spent the rest of his life trying to find ways to honor Victoria's memory. The hotel installed safety systems to prevent similar accidents, but some guests and staff members believe that Victoria's spirit became trapped in the elevator where she died, still searching for the wedding that never happened. That evening, Dr. Mitchell decided to conduct her own investigation by riding the elevator multiple times and documenting any unusual phenomena she experienced. She brought recording equipment and psychological assessment tools, hoping to apply scientific methodology to understanding what appeared to be a supernatural manifestation of unresolved trauma. Thomas, the elevator operator, agreed to assist with her investigation. Though he admitted to being nervous about deliberately seeking contact with Victoria's spirit. On her third ride of the evening, as the elevator passed the 7th floor, Dr. Mitchell experienced the phenomena that had been reported by other guests. The temperature in the elevator car dropped dramatically, and the mirrors began to fog over as if someone were breathing on them from the inside. Most remarkably, a figure began to materialize in the reflection. A young woman in an elaborate 1920s wedding dress, with tears streaming down her face and an expression of desperate confusion and fear. "William," the apparition said clearly, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space of the elevator car. "William, where are you? The ceremony was supposed to start an hour ago and I can't find my way out of here. Please, someone help me find William. He must be so worried about me." Dr. Mitchell realized that she was witnessing a classic case of what psychologists call traumatic imprinting. Victoria's spirit was trapped in an endless loop of her final moments, reliving the confusion and fear she had experienced while trapped in the malfunctioning elevator. The bride's ghost was not malevolent or threatening, but rather a soul in profound distress, unable to understand that she had died and that her wedding day had become her last day on earth. "Victoria," Dr. Mitchell said gently, applying the same calm and reassuring tone she used with her living trauma patients. "My name is Dr. Mitchell, and I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what you remember about today?" The ghostly bride turned toward Dr. Mitchell's voice, her expression brightening with hope and relief at finding someone who could see and hear her. "Oh, thank goodness. I've been trying to get someone's attention for so long. I'm supposed to be getting married today, but something went wrong with the elevator, and now I can't find my way to the church. William must be frantic with worry. Can you help me get to the lobby? My bridal party is waiting for me there." Dr. Mitchell realized that Victoria's spirit was completely unaware that she had died nearly a century ago. The traumatic circumstances of her death had created a psychological prison that prevented her from accepting the reality of her situation and moving on to whatever comes after death. Using techniques she had developed for treating patients with severe trauma and dissociative disorders, Dr. Mitchell began to gently guide Victoria toward understanding her true circumstances. "Victoria, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dr. Mitchell said with the kind of professional compassion that had made her successful in treating difficult cases. "You've been in this elevator for a very long time, much longer than you realize. The wedding you're trying to get to, it happened many years ago. You didn't make it to the church because something tragic happened while you were trapped in here." The conversation that followed was one of the most challenging and emotionally demanding that Dr. Mitchell had ever conducted. Victoria's spirit struggled to accept the reality of her death, clinging to the hope that she could still make it to her wedding and marry the man she loved. Dr. Mitchell had to carefully balance truth with compassion, helping Victoria understand her situation without causing additional trauma to a soul that had already suffered so much. "But William is waiting for me," Victoria pleaded, her ghostly form becoming more agitated as she began to grasp the implications of what Dr. Mitchell was telling her. "He loves me, and I love him, and we're supposed to be together forever. If what you're saying is true, then I'll never see him again." Dr. Mitchell explained gently that William had lived a full life after Victoria's death, though he had never married another woman. She helped Victoria understand that their love had been real and meaningful, but that clinging to the past was preventing her from finding peace and potentially reuniting with William in whatever realm awaited them after death. The process was slow and difficult, requiring multiple conversations over several days as Victoria's spirit gradually accepted the truth about her circumstances. "The love you shared with William was beautiful and real," Dr. Mitchell assured her during their final conversation. "But love doesn't mean holding on forever. Sometimes it means letting go so that both souls can find peace. William lived his entire life honoring your memory, and now it's time for you to honor that love by allowing yourself to move on to wherever he's waiting for you." The breakthrough came when Victoria finally understood that her desperate attempts to reach her wedding had been keeping her trapped in a cycle of suffering that prevented her from experiencing the eternal love she had been seeking. With Dr. Mitchell's guidance, she was able to let go of her attachment to that tragic day and accept the transition that death represented. "Thank you for helping me understand," Victoria said as her form began to fade for the final time. "I can see him now. William is here, and he's been waiting for me all along. We're going to have our wedding after all, just not in the way I had originally planned." The elevator filled with warm, golden light as Victoria's spirit finally found peace, and Dr. Mitchell felt a profound sense of completion as she witnessed the resolution of a tragedy that had lasted for nearly a century. The ghostly bride's final words were a message of gratitude and a blessing for all the couples who would ride that elevator in the future, wishing them the happiness that she and William had finally found in the realm beyond death. And there you have it. 11 terrifying true stories that prove hotels can harbor secrets far darker than anything you'll find in the minibar. From decomposing heads in closets to phantom weddings that never end, these experiences remind us that when we check into a hotel, we're not just renting a room. We're entering a space where countless human dramas have played out. And sometimes, those dramas refuse to end. The next time you slide that key card and step into your hotel room, remember these stories. Pay attention to that strange smell you can't identify. Listen carefully to those unexplained sounds in the hallway, and don't dismiss that feeling of being watched as mere imagination. Sometimes, the previous guests never really checked out, and they might be more interested in your stay than you'd ever want them to be. My advice? Always research the history of any hotel before you book. Check online reviews, not just for service quality, but for any mentions of unusual experiences or strange atmospheres. Pack sage or protective items if you're spiritually inclined, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about a room, ask to be moved immediately. Most importantly, remember that respect goes a long way with supernatural entities. If you do encounter something unexplained, remain calm and polite. After all, you're a guest in their eternal home. Sweet dreams, and remember, in hotels, you're never truly alone. Make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more true horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the places we trust to keep us safe. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into the terrifying world of haunted hospitals, where some patients never fully recover. Until then, sleep tight, and always check who's really sharing your room.